The morning sky above Whispering Pines Valley had transformed from pristine blue to a churning mass of charcoal clouds, their swollen bellies threatening to burst at any moment. What had begun as a gentle autumn day had morphed without warning into something more ominous as the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the rugged landscape. The dense forest that bordered the normally placid Silverstone River rustled nervously, its leaves shivering in the quickening wind as animals sought shelter from the approaching storm. Mason Thorne pulled his weathered leather jacket tighter around his broad shoulders as he trudged along the narrow hiking trail. The retired park ranger had spent 30 years navigating these woods, and his instincts warned him this storm would be fierce. The metallic scent of rain hung heavy in the air, and the barometric pressure had dropped so rapidly, his old shoulder. Injury ached in protest. He should turn back, logic demanded it. Yet something urged him onward, an inexplicable pull he couldn't quite explain even to himself. The first heavy droplets began to fall, pattering against the forest canopy like impatient fingers drumming on a table. Mason quickened his pace, his hiking boots crushing the carpet of auburn and gold leaves that blanketed the forest floor. He knew of a small outcropping about half a mile ahead, a natural shelter formed by ancient granite boulders that had tumbled down the mountainside centuries ago. If he hurried, he might reach it before the skies truly opened. The Silverstone River ran parallel to his path, usually a gentle companion on his frequent hikes. Today, however, it roared with newfound fury, swollen by 3 days of rainfall upstream. In the mountains, its normally crystal waters had transformed into a churning mass of silt-brown liquid that devoured the banks with hungry persistence. Mason kept a respectful distance, mindful of the riverbank's increasing fragility. The river had claimed lives before. It was not to be underestimated. A deafening crack of thunder split the air, so close that Mason felt it reverberate in his chest. The sky darkened further, plunging the forest into premature twilight. The rain intensified, no longer individual drops, but sheets of water that reduced visibility to mere yards. Mason muttered a curse under his breath. The outcropping was still too far, and the storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity. That's when he heard it, a sound so out of place that it stopped him in his tracks despite the downpour. At first, he thought it was just another voice of the storm, perhaps a branch scraping against another in the wind. But then it came again, rising above the rainfall's persistent drumming and the river's angry growls, a desperate, high-pitched cry that raised the hair on Mason's neck. It was primal, panicked, the unmistakable sound of a creature in distress. Mason turned toward the river, squinting against the rain that pelted his weathered face. Through the grey curtain of water, he spotted movement on the far bank, a tawny form pacing frantically at the water's edge. His experienced eyes recognized the distinctive silhouette immediately. A female bobcat, her muscular body rigid with distress, her spotted coat plastered to her frame by the relentless rain. Even from this distance, Mason could see her agitation, the frantic back-and-forth motion, the way she would approach the water's edge, only to retreat in obvious conflict. Bobcats were notoriously solitary and shy, avoiding human contact at all costs. For one to remain in place with a human nearby meant something was terribly wrong. Mason fumbled in his pocket for his compact binoculars, struggling to keep the lenses clear as the rain intensified. When he finally managed to focus on the scene across the river, his stomach dropped. In the churning waters, barely visible against the brown current, a tiny head bobbed and thrashed. A bobcat cub, impossibly small against the river's might, fighting desperately to keep afloat. The mother's cries grew more frantic, a series of urgent yowls that pierced the storm's cacophony. She would dash along the bank, matching her cub's downstream drift, occasionally pawing at the water, only to jerk back from the punishing current. Bobcats were capable swimmers when necessary, But the raging river today would challenge even the strongest adult, and the mother knew it. Her terror was palpable, a mirror of the panic Mason could see in the cub's failing struggles. Without conscious thought, Mason's feet carried him closer to his side of the riverbank. Rain streamed down his face as he scanned the churning waters, measuring distances, calculating risks with the automatic precision born from decades in wilderness rescue. The cub was weakening visibly, its tiny head disappearing beneath the surface. For longer periods before popping up again, each time with less energy than before. Mason estimated the river's width at nearly 40 feet at this point, its depth unknowable but certainly dangerous. The current ripped past at a speed that could easily sweep away a full-grown man. The rational part of his mind, the part shaped by years of training and hard-learned lessons, catalogued all the reasons intervention was impossible, foolhardy, potentially fatal. Yet, as the mother bobcat let out another heart-wrenching cry, something shifted inside Mason's chest. Age had taken much from him. His wife 5 years ago to cancer, his job to mandatory retirement, some of his strength to the simple passage of time. But standing there in the pounding rain, watching a mother's helpless anguish as her child fought for life, Mason felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Sometimes, the only answer to impossible odds was impossible courage. The raging current sent spray into the air as it collided with partially submerged rocks and fallen trees. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs as he quickly shrugged off his backpack, letting it fall heavily onto the sodden ground. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the zipper of his jacket before finally yanking it down. The wet leather clung to his arms as he wrestled it off, draping it over a nearby branch with mechanical precision. "Hold on," he muttered, the words lost in the storm's fury, directed as much to himself as to the struggling cub, now 20 yards downstream. The mother bobcat had noticed him now, her attention split between her drowning offspring and the human on the opposite bank, her ears flattened against her skull, her stance wavering between desperate concern for her cub and instinctive fear of the large human making rapid movements. A low growl rumbled from her throat, barely audible over the storm, but conveying a clear warning despite her vulnerable position. Mason removed his watch and emptied his pockets, mind racing through the river rescue training he'd received decades ago. The Silverstone was a Class 3 rapid today, possibly Class 4 in some sections, dangerous even for professional rescue teams with proper equipment. He had none of that, just his aging body and a lifetime of wilderness experience that screamed this attempt was madness. The cub disappeared beneath the surface again, this time for so long that Mason's breath caught painfully in his throat. When the tiny head finally reappeared, it was barely moving, the fight visibly draining from the small creature. The mother's cries changed pitch, becoming something Mason had never heard before, a sound of such pure anguish that it cut through his hesitation like a knife. He kicked off his boots and socks, toes digging into the cold, wet earth. His left knee, injured during a rescue operation years ago, protested as he crouched slightly, preparing himself. Mason took 3 deep breaths, eyes never leaving the struggling cub, calculating the point of entry that would best utilize the current, rather than fighting directly against it. Diagonal downstream, he reminded himself, the old rescue mantra surfacing from memory, never straight across. The rain pounded against his bare head, plastering his grey hair to his scalp as he took one final steadying breath. Then, with a powerful push from legs that had hiked these mountains for over 40 years, Mason launched himself into the churning waters. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. For one disorienting moment, the world narrowed to nothing but shocking cold and the roar of water in his ears. His body instinctively curled against the assault before training took over. He forced his limbs to extend, fighting to establish the proper rescue swimming position, feet downstream, slightly on his back to see obstacles coming, arms out for steering and stability. The current gripped him immediately, far stronger than he'd anticipated. It yanked him downstream with terrifying speed, spinning him once before he managed to regain control. Every muscle strained as he worked to angle himself across the river, while still moving with the flow. Fighting directly against such force would be suicide. His only chance was to work with it, guiding his trajectory like a leaf riding the wind. Mason's eyes burned from the splashing water, vision blurring as he searched desperately for the cub. For several heart-stopping seconds, he couldn't locate the tiny creature, and fear clutched at his chest. Had he been too late? Then a small flash of movement caught his attention. The cub had been swept against a partially submerged tree branch, its weakened body temporarily caught in the wooden fingers that both trapped and supported it. With powerful strokes, Mason adjusted his course, aiming for the temporary sanctuary. His body protested, muscles burning with exertion, lungs laboring to maintain the careful rhythm of breathing between waves. The cold was already seeping into his core, slowing his responses, making each movement more deliberate but less precise. Submerged rock scraped against his thigh with enough force to draw blood, the pain momentarily sharp before the cold water numbed it. Mason barely registered the injury, his focus entirely on the struggling cub, now just yards away. On the shore, the mother bobcat paced frantically, following their downstream progress with unblinking intensity, her soaked fur making her appear smaller and more vulnerable than her wild nature suggested. The distance to the cub closed agonizingly slowly. 5 yards, 4, 3. Mason could now see the creature clearly, no larger than a house cat, its spotted fur plastered against its tiny frame, revealing the fragile ribcage heaving with desperate breaths. Its eyes were wide with terror, the same amber shade as its mother's, but clouded with exhaustion and the encroaching dullness that preceded surrender. 2 yards. 1. Mason's fingers brushed against the rough bark of the submerged branch, gripping it to stabilize himself against the current's relentless push. The wood creaked ominously, its tenuous anchor to the riverbed, threatening to give way under this new weight. He had seconds, perhaps less, before the natural dam collapsed. The cub noticed him now, its dull eyes suddenly sharpening with renewed fear at this new, massive predator approaching. Despite its exhaustion, it managed a weak hiss, tiny teeth bared in a final defiant display of wildness. The sight sparked something in Mason's chest, a profound respect for the fighting spirit contained in such a small, beleaguered body. "It's all right," Mason said, his voice barely audible over the water's roar. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words meant nothing to the wild creature, but the gentle, steady tone seemed to penetrate its panic. As Mason inched closer, hand extending cautiously, the cub's desperate struggles slowed, whether from recognition of help or simply the last of its energy failing, he couldn't tell. With one arm anchored around the creaking branch, Mason reached, for the cub. His fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from the delicacy required. Too rough a grip could injure the fragile creature, too gentle, and the river would snatch it away. The branch shifted beneath him, a warning that their temporary sanctuary was moments from collapse. "Come here, little one," Mason whispered, his voice steady, despite the chaos surrounding them. The cub's amber eyes fixed on Mason's approaching hand, its tiny body tensing. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended, man and wild creature caught, in a moment of connection that transcended the natural order. Then the branch gave a violent lurch, partially tearing free from its tenuous hold on the riverbed. The sudden movement startled the cub, which scrambled desperately along the shifting wood. Its weakened claws failed to find purchase on the slick bark, and with a pitiful mewl, it slipped back into the churning current. Mason lunged forward without thinking, releasing his stabilizing hold on the branch. His fingers closed around wet fur, but the cub's sodden body was slippery, nearly impossible to grasp firmly. For one terrible moment, he felt it sliding through his fingers. Then, with a desperate adjustment of his grip, he secured the tiny creature against his chest. The victory was momentary. Freed from his anchor, Mason felt the river reclaim him with brutal force. The current spun them both, disorienting him as water closed over his head. He fought to the surface, gasping for air, one arm cradling the cub protectively above the waterline, while his free arm and legs worked frantically to stabilize their position. The shore seemed impossibly distant, the mother's frantic pacing a blur of motion through the rain and splashing water. Mason attempted to angle toward the bank, but the current had other ideas, dragging them toward a section of rapids that churned white and angry 30 yards downstream. The roar of water smashing against rocks grew louder, a deadly promise of what awaited if he couldn't reach the shore. The cub had gone eerily still in his grasp, its tiny body limp, whether from fear or exhaustion, Mason couldn't tell. The creature's surrender to its fate sent a surge of protective determination through his tired muscles. He hadn't risked everything to lose this battle now. With renewed vigor, Mason executed a powerful side stroke, his legs kicking in unison while his free arm carved through the water. Each movement was a battle against the current, gaining inches toward the shore while the river pulled them yards downstream. His lungs burned, muscles screaming in protest as the cold continued to leach away his strength and coordination. Through the curtain of rain, Mason glimpsed a fallen pine, extending partially into the water about 20 yards ahead. Its massive trunk had recently succumbed to erosion, toppling into the river to create a natural bridge from shore to current. If he could reach it, Mason adjusted his trajectory, allowing the river to carry them slightly faster while he concentrated on lateral movement. The rapids loomed closer, their hungry growl a constant reminder of the stakes. The fallen pine grew larger in his vision, salvation within reach if he timed this perfectly. 10 yards to the tree. The cub stirred weakly in his grasp, a tiny paw pressing against Mason's wrist in what felt like an unconscious plea for life. 5 yards. Mason gathered his remaining strength, aware this would be their only chance. As they drew alongside the fallen pine, Mason lunged for a protruding branch, his fingers scraping against rough bark before finding purchase. The sudden arrest of their downstream momentum wrenched his shoulder painfully, nearly tearing the cub from his grasp. Gritting his teeth against the fire spreading through his joint, Mason held firm, gradually pulling them closer to the massive trunk. Hand over hand, one excruciating movement at a time, he dragged himself and his tiny charge along the tree toward shore. Each pull was a negotiation with his failing body, a battle of will over physical limitation. The cub remained motionless against his chest, its only signs of life the shallow rise and fall of its ribcage and occasional twitches of its tail. From the riverbank, the mother bobcat tracked their laborious progress, her posture transformed from frantic pacing to an alert, coiled stillness. Her ears swiveled forward, eyes unblinking as she watched the strange, slow-motion rescue unfold. When Mason was halfway to shore, she moved decisively, positioning herself at the exact point where the fallen pine met the earth. Mason's focus narrowed to the simple mechanical task of movement. Grab, pull, breathe, repeat. The shore grew closer, the sound of rapids fading slightly as they gained distance from the deadly churn. His vision had begun to narrow, dark spots dancing at the periphery, warning signs of hypothermia and exhaustion that the ranger in him recognized, but the man dismissed. Not yet. He couldn't falter yet. After what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only minutes, Mason's feet touched something solid, a submerged portion of the riverbank. With a final surge of determination, he half-crawled, half-dragged himself, and the cub up the slippery incline until they were fully clear of the water's grasp. Only then did he allow himself to collapse onto his side, chest heaving. The cub still clutched protectively against him. For several moments, Mason simply breathed, each inhalation a victory against the crushing exhaustion threatening to pull him into darkness. The rain continued to fall, gentler now, as if the storm itself had spent its fury. Slowly, awareness of his surroundings returned, the feel of sodden earth beneath him, the persistent chill of wet clothes against skin, and the growing warmth of the small body against his chest. The cub stirred, its movements stronger now that the immediate danger had passed. Mason carefully loosened his grip, allowing the creature space, while ensuring it couldn't bolt in its confused state. Amber eyes blinked open, focusing with visible effort as the cub processed its changed circumstances. A soft, questioning sound escaped its throat, not quite a meow, not quite a growl, but something uniquely feline that spoke of bewilderment and lingering fear. "You're safe now," Mason murmured, his voice hoarse from exertion. "You're safe." As if understanding the sentiment, if not the words, the cub's tiny body relaxed slightly. It made no attempt to escape, instead pressing closer to the warmth of Mason's body in an instinctive search for comfort and heat. The simple trust in the gesture tightened Mason's throat with emotion. Then a shadow fell across them both, and Mason froze. The mother bobcat stood less than 5 feet away, her body tensed, ears flattened against her skull. Despite her relatively small size, no more than 25 pounds, she radiated a predator's dangerous intensity. Her amber eyes, so like her cubs, were fixed not on her offspring, but on Mason's face with unnerving intelligence and calculation. Time seemed to crystallize as man and wildcat regarded each other across the diminishing space. Every instinct honed by decades in the wilderness screamed at Mason to protect his face and throat, to make himself larger, to prepare for the fury of a mother reclaiming her young. A bobcat, half-starved and frightened, was dangerous. A mother defending her offspring was lethal. The silent standoff stretched for several heartbeats, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder rolling away across the valley. Mason remained perfectly still, barely breathing. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. His left hand still cradled the cub, which had begun to shiver violently against him, tiny body working desperately to generate heat. The mother's eyes flickered to her offspring, noting these tremors, and something shifted in her posture, a nearly imperceptible lowering of her shoulders, a minute twitch of her whiskers. Decision crystallizing behind those amber eyes. "Easy," Mason whispered, the word barely audible even to his own ears. "I'm not your enemy." With exquisite slowness, keeping his movements fluid and non-threatening, Mason used his free hand to push himself into a sitting position. The change in posture sent fresh pain lancing through his overtaxed muscles, but he kept his expression neutral, his gaze steady but non-challenging. The mother bobcat tensed momentarily at the movement, her claws digging into the soft earth, but she made no aggressive advance. The cub stirred more actively now, perhaps sensing its mother's presence. It let out a plaintive cry, weak but determined, a sound that vibrated against Mason's palm. The call triggered an immediate response. The mother's ears swiveled forward, her pupils dilating as she took a tentative step closer, then another. Her movements were a study in contradictions, the cautious approach of a predator, balanced against the desperate need of a parent. Mason calculated his options with the clarity that often accompanies extreme situations. He could attempt to set the cub down and back away, but in its weakened state, the young bobcat needed immediate attention and warmth. The chilling rain had abated somewhat, but the damage was done. The tiny creature's body temperature had dropped dangerously low. Without intervention, hypothermia would claim it regardless of its reunion with its mother. "Your little one needs help," Mason said softly, maintaining the gentle cadence that seemed to keep the situation from escalating. "More than either of us can provide alone." Decision made, Mason slowly, deliberately shifted the cub in his arms, bringing it more prominently into view, while keeping his movements telegraphed and smooth. The mother bobcat's gaze locked onto her offspring, her nostrils flaring as she processed its condition through senses far more acute than human understanding. A rumbling sound emerged from her throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something between that conveyed both warning and distress. "I know," Mason continued, the one-sided conversation oddly steadying, "but we need to get somewhere dry, both of us, for the little one's sake." With the same deliberate slowness, Mason began the laborious process of rising to his feet. His body protested violently, muscles cramping, the scratch on his thigh burning, his injured shoulder throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Halfway up, a particularly sharp pain caused him to grimace involuntarily. The mother bobcat immediately responded, dropping into a half-crouch, her tail swishing in agitation. Mason froze again, waiting for the moment to pass. "Just old bones complaining," he murmured. "Nothing to worry about." After what seemed an eternity, he achieved a standing position, the cub securely held against his chest with both hands now. The mother bobcat remained impossibly still, her eyes tracking every minute movement. Mason took a tentative step backward, then another, beginning a gradual retreat toward the forest path. To his astonishment, the mother bobcat followed, maintaining a consistent distance of about 6 feet, close enough to spring if threatened, far enough to retreat if necessary. An uneasy truce, negotiated in silence. The unlikely procession moved slowly through the dripping forest. Mason's boots and socks remained where he'd left them nearly half a mile upstream, leaving him to navigate the rough terrain barefoot. Sharp stones and fallen branches bit into his soles, but he barely registered the discomfort, his attention divided between the path ahead and the wild predator shadowing his steps. The cub had fallen into a concerning lethargy, its earlier movements subsiding into occasional twitches. Time was becoming critical. Mason's destination emerged through the trees after 15 minutes of careful hiking. A small, weathered cabin, nestled against a rocky outcropping that protected it from the worst of the mountain weather. It wasn't much to look at. A simple one-room structure built decades ago as a Forest Service outpost and later abandoned when budget cuts reduced the ranger presence in the remote area. Mason had discovered it years ago during his patrols and had quietly maintained it as a personal sanctuary after retirement, a place to reconnect with the wilderness that had shaped his life. As they approached the cabin's small clearing, the mother bobcat hesitated, her instinctive wariness of human dwellings asserting itself. She paced at the forest's edge, her internal conflict visible in every movement, the need to follow her cub, warring with deeply ingrained survival instincts that had kept her species alive for thousands of years. Mason paused at the cabin's weather-beaten door, turning to face the hesitant predator. "Your choice," he said softly, "but your little one needs warmth, now." Without waiting for a response that couldn't come in any language he could understand, Mason pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped into the dim interior. The cabin was Spartan but well-maintained, a small wood stove against one wall, a narrow cot in the corner, shelves lined with basic supplies and emergency equipment. Most importantly, it was dry, the solid roof having kept the worst of the storm at bay. Moving quickly now that he was free from the mother's scrutiny, Mason gathered towels from a storage trunk and laid them near the cold wood stove. He placed the cub gently on this makeshift nest, noting with concern how the small creature barely responded to the change in position. Working with practiced efficiency, Mason built a fire in the stove, his cold-numbed fingers fumbling with matches before finally coaxing flames from the dry kindling he kept stored in a metal bin. As warmth slowly began to permeate the cabin, Mason turned his attention back to the cub. He carefully toweled the worst of the moisture from its fur, monitoring its responses for signs of distress or pain that might indicate injuries beyond the obvious exhaustion and cold. The cub's eyes remained closed, but its breathing had steadied. Somewhat, a positive sign amid many worrying ones. A soft scratching at the door interrupted his ministrations. Mason straightened, wincing as his back protested the movement. He'd left the door slightly ajar, uncertain whether the mother would find the courage to follow, but unwilling to close off the possibility. Now, it seemed, her concern for her offspring had overcome her natural caution. "Come in if you're coming," Mason called softly, stepping away from the cub and moving to the opposite side of the small room, giving the doorway a wide berth. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, like a shadow detaching itself from the gathering dusk outside, the mother bobcat slipped through the narrow opening. She paused just inside, every muscle coiled for immediate flight, nostrils flaring as she processed the unfamiliar smells of the human dwelling. Her eyes darted around the cabin, cataloging exit points, threats, and most importantly, the location of her cub. The sight of her offspring lying motionless on the towels broke her hesitation. With silent, fluid grace, she crossed to the makeshift nest, circling it twice before settling beside the cub. Her rough tongue immediately went to work, licking her young one with methodical thoroughness, instinctively providing the stimulation needed to improve circulation and warm its core. Mason remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as he witnessed this unprecedented moment, a wild predator voluntarily entering a human dwelling, tolerating human presence while tending to her young. In 30 years as a ranger, he'd never heard of such behavior, let alone witnessed it. The mother bobcat was breaking every rule of wild instinct, driven by something stronger than fear, maternal devotion that transcended natural caution. "That's it," Mason encouraged softly. "You know what to do better than I ever could." The mother's ears flicked in his direction, acknowledging his voice without pausing in her ministrations. The dynamic in the cabin had shifted subtly but significantly. This was no longer his territory that she had entered, but a shared space with an unspoken purpose. The boundaries between wild and tame, predator and human, seemed to blur in the warm glow of the wood stove's light. Mason took advantage of the temporary détente to attend to his own needs, stripping off his sodden shirt and replacing it with a dry flannel from a hook by the door. His jeans would have to wait. Removing them might appear too much like threatening movement to his wary visitor. Instead, he wrung out what water he could and moved closer to the stove, seeking the same warmth that was gradually reviving the cub. As the minutes stretched into an hour, a remarkable transformation took place in the cabin's atmosphere. The mother bobcat's initial tension had subsided into wary tolerance, her focus remaining primarily on her cub, which had begun showing more signs of life, twitching, occasionally mewling, eventually opening its eyes for brief periods. Mason maintained his distance but spoke occasionally in low, soothing tones, a one-sided conversation that seemed to normalize his presence for the wild visitor. Night had fully descended outside, the storm's fury gradually subsiding into a gentle patter against the cabin's tin roof. Mason had added more wood to the stove, building the fire to a steady blaze that filled the small space with golden warmth. He'd positioned himself on a wooden chair, maintaining a respectful distance from the unlikely pair by the stove, close enough to observe but far enough to provide the mother bobcat with a sense of security. The cub had improved markedly over the past hours. What had begun as occasional twitches had progressed to more deliberate movements, stretching, shifting position, even attempting to groom itself before giving up and submitting to its mother's more thorough ministrations. Its amber eyes, when open, appeared clearer, more focused, the earlier glaze of exhaustion replaced by the natural curiosity of youth. The mother's persistent licking had restored the cub's fur to a semblance of its natural fluffiness, the distinctive, spotted pattern emerging as it dried. Mason watched the pair with quiet amazement, aware he was witnessing something few humans had ever seen. The private bonding between mother and child in a species known for its secretive nature. Bobcats were ghost-like creatures that haunted the forests of North America, rarely glimpsed even by those who spent their lives in the wilderness. To be sharing a living space with not one but two, to be accepted, however tentatively, into their presence was nothing short of extraordinary. "You're quite the fighter," Mason addressed the cub softly, noting how its ears swiveled in his direction at the sound of his voice. "Didn't give up even when the odds were impossible. That's a good quality in this world." The mother's grooming paused momentarily as Mason spoke, her amber eyes fixing on him with that same unnerving intelligence he'd noticed earlier. There was wariness there still, certainly, but something else had crept in alongside it. A grudging acknowledgement, perhaps even the faintest shadow of trust. She hadn't fled at the first opportunity, hadn't positioned herself between Mason and her cub in defensive posture, hadn't displayed the aggression any wildlife expert would have predicted in such circumstances. "You're quite remarkable yourself," Mason continued, including the mother in his one-sided conversation. "Most wild things would have abandoned a drowning cub as lost, preserving energy for the surviving offspring or future litters. Nature can be pragmatic that way, but you stayed, called for help even when none seemed possible." He smiled faintly. "Stubbornness might run in your family." As if understanding it was being discussed, the cub attempted to stand, wobbling precariously on unsteady legs, before collapsing back into the nest of towels. The effort seemed to exhaust its limited reserves of energy, and it curled into a tight ball against its mother's side, eyes closing once more. The mother nudged it gently with her nose before resuming her grooming, this time with less urgency and more of the automatic rhythm of routine care. Mason's stomach rumbled, reminding him that his own needs had been neglected in the drama of the afternoon. Moving slowly, telegraphing each action to avoid startling his visitors, he reached for his backpack, which he'd placed near the door upon entering. The mother bobcat tracked his movements, muscles tensing slightly, but maintaining her position beside her cub. From the pack, Mason withdrew a foil-wrapped sandwich, simple fare he'd packed for his solitary hike, never imagining he would be sharing his evening with such unusual company. The crinkle of foil drew the mother's attention more sharply, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of food. Mason unwrapped the sandwich deliberately, breaking off a small piece of turkey and holding it out in an open palm. "Hungry? It's not whatever you usually hunt, but protein is protein." The offer hung in the air between them, a gesture that bridged two worlds, the calculated civility of human interaction and the straightforward survival-based relationships of the wild. The mother bobcat regarded the offering with obvious interest, her nose twitching as she processed the unfamiliar scent, but made no move to accept it. Mason nodded, unsurprised, and placed the morsel on the floor midway between them before retreating to his chair with the remainder of his meal. "No pressure. It's there if you want it." Mason ate his sandwich slowly, deliberately keeping his eyes averted from the bobcat and the offering, providing her the illusion of privacy to make her decision without scrutiny. From his peripheral vision, he saw her shift position slightly, attention divided between the food, her cub, and the human whose intentions remained an uncertain equation in her world of instinct and experience. Several minutes passed in this tableau of mutual awareness and careful pretense, Then, with the smooth grace that characterized all her movements, the mother rose from her position, her steps silent on the wooden floor as she approached the offering. She paused just short of it, whiskers twitching as she performed a final assessment, then delicately lifted the morsel with teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. Rather than retreating immediately as Mason had expected, she consumed the bite where she stood, her gaze returning to him with renewed evaluation. Good, isn't it? Not exactly wilderness cuisine, but my wife used to say I made a decent sandwich. Mason's voice caught slightly on the mention of Sarah, the familiar ache in his chest resurging briefly before subsiding back into the dull constancy that had been his companion these 5 years past. She'd never believe this moment if she were here. 35 years married to a ranger, and even she never saw a bobcat up close. You folks are good at keeping your privacy. The mother bobcat had finished the morsel and remained in place, her attention now fully on Mason rather than divided between him and the food. Something in his tone or posture seemed to register with her in a way that transcended the boundaries of species. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the small cabin, two beings who had begun the day as natural adversaries, now connected by an improbable alliance forged in crisis. Then, in a gesture that sent a ripple of astonishment, through Mason, the mother bobcat deliberately closed the remaining distance between them. She moved with slow precision, each step placed with careful consideration until she stood less than 2 feet from his chair. At this proximity, Mason could see details lost at greater distances, the individual spots that patterned her tawny coat, the slight nick in one ear that spoke of past confrontations, the rise and fall of her ribcage with each measured breath. Mason remained perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe. This close, he was acutely aware of her predator's nature, the powerful muscles beneath that deceptively slender frame, capable of bringing down prey larger than herself, the sharp teeth designed for killing efficiency, the claws that could inflict grievous damage with a single swipe. Yet fear was not the emotion that dominated his response to this unprecedented proximity. Instead, he felt a profound sense of privilege of being granted access to a moment of connection that defied the natural order. "Hello there," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. The mother bobcat's head tilted slightly, ears swiveling to capture the nuances of his voice. Then, with deliberate intent, she lowered her head and briefly, fleetingly, pressed her forehead against Mason's knee before withdrawing to return to her cub. The contact lasted no more than a second, but its significance shook Mason to his core. In the language of felines, that brief touch was a gesture of acceptance, of acknowledging another as non-threatening, perhaps even in some limited sense as part of an extended social group. Mason sat motionless long after she had returned. To her offspring, the point on his knee where she had touched him, seeming to tingle with the memory of contact. In 30 years as a ranger, he had encountered thousands of wild animals, handled many in the line of duty, observed countless natural behaviors, but never, in all that time, had he experienced anything that felt so profoundly like communication, across the seemingly unbridgeable divide between human and wild. "Thank you," he said finally, the words inadequate to express the complexity of what had just transpired between them. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, the clearing storm revealing a night sky ablaze with stars visible through the cabins. Single window. The temperature was dropping rapidly in the storm's wake, the mountain air crystallizing into the sharp chill that presaged frost by morning. Mason added another log to the stove, preparing for a night that would grow colder before dawn. The cub was sleeping soundly now, its breathing deep and regular, body occasionally twitching with dreams, whose content Mason could not begin to imagine. The mother had settled again beside her offspring, but her posture was different now, more relaxed, her vigilance slightly reduced in the presence of this human who had proven himself not through words, but through actions she could understand. Her eyes remained open, alert, but the tension had largely drained from her powerful frame. Mason leaned back in his chair, fatigue washing over him in waves now that the adrenaline of the day's events had fully subsided. His body ached in a dozen places, the cold swim and strenuous rescue demanding a toll his aging frame would be paying for days to come. Yet beneath the discomfort lay a profound sense of contentment, a quiet joy that had been absent from his life for longer than he cared to acknowledge. "Been a while since this place had guests," he remarked softly to his drowsing companions. "Sarah and I used to come here on weekends, back when I was still actively ranging these parts. She'd bring her sketchbooks, spend hours drawing the wildflowers while I checked trails and maintained markers." He smiled at the memory. "She always hoped she'd see one of you, had a special fascination with bobcats. Called you the perfect predator. Beautiful but practical, specialized but adaptable." Dawn broke across Whispering Pines Valley. In a spectacular display of gold and crimson, the aftermath of the storm lending unusual clarity to the air. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, creating a warm rectangle on the wooden floor where mother and cub still lay curled together. Mason had dozed fitfully in his chair throughout the night, unwilling to move to the cot and risk disturbing the fragile trust that had developed between himself and his wild guests. His body protested as he shifted position, stiff muscles and joints reminding him that at 62, sleeping upright was no longer something he could do without consequences. The movement caught the mother bobcat's attention immediately, her head lifting, eyes instantly alert, despite having slept as lightly as Mason himself. The cub, however, remained deeply asleep, its small body rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of secure slumber. "Morning," Mason greeted softly. "Looks like your little one is doing much better." Indeed, the transformation in the cub from the previous evening was remarkable. Its fur had dried completely, restoring the characteristic plushness of a healthy bobcat's coat. The worrying lethargy had given way to the deep restorative sleep of youth. Even in unconsciousness, there was a vitality to the small creature that had been notably absent when Mason had first pulled it from the river's grasp. Moving with deliberate slowness, Mason rose from his chair, wincing as his back and knees protested the movement. The mother watched him closely, but without the earlier tension, her posture remaining relaxed as she observed his careful progress toward the wood stove. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, the cabin still warm but cooling as the morning advanced. Mason added kindling and another small log, coaxing the flames back to life with practiced ease. "You two are welcome to stay as long as you need," he said, knowing the words meant nothing to his visitors, but finding comfort in the one-sided conversation nonetheless. "But I'm guessing you'll be eager to get back to your territory once the little one is fully recovered. Can't say I blame you. This is hardly natural accommodation for your kind." The mother bobcat yawned widely, displaying impressive teeth designed for tearing flesh, before beginning her morning grooming ritual. Her rough tongue moved methodically over her forepaws and face, the ordinary behavior striking Mason with its contradiction. This wild predator engaging in such domestic activity within a human dwelling, seemingly at ease despite everything. Her instincts should be telling her. Mason took advantage of her apparent comfort to make his way to the small shelf that served as his kitchen area. He filled a battered kettle with water from a jug he kept stored in the cabin, setting it on the wood stove to heat for coffee. His movements were unhurried, natural, a continuation of the non-threatening behavior that had allowed this unprecedented cohabitation to develop. "Coffee for me. I'm afraid I don't have any suitable breakfast for bobcats on hand," he commented wryly. "Though I suppose I could open a can of tuna if you're interested." The mention of food, or perhaps just the continued sound of his voice, seemed to catch the mother's attention. She paused in her grooming, regarding him with that same intelligent assessment that had struck Mason from their first encounter. There was something unusually perceptive in her gaze, a quality of awareness that went beyond the already impressive cognitive abilities of her species. Mason had encountered thousands of wild animals during his career, and he recognized the rare quality when he saw it. This was an exceptional individual, even among bobcats. As the water in the kettle began to heat, Mason retrieved his backpack and extracted the remainder of his food supplies: another sandwich wrapped in foil, an apple, and a small plastic container of trail mix. Not a feast, but enough to fuel him for the hike back to civilization. He unwrapped the sandwich and, following the precedent established the previous evening, broke off a small piece of turkey and placed it on the floor midway between them. This time, the mother's response was different. Rather than waiting for Mason to retreat, she rose immediately and approached the offering with confident steps. She consumed the morsel quickly, then looked up at him with clear expectation. Mason laughed softly, surprised by the directness of her behavior. "Well, you're a quick study, aren't you? Figured out the system already." He broke off another small piece, this time holding it in his open palm rather than placing it on the floor. It was a test, a gentle pushing of boundaries to see just how far this unusual trust might extend. The mother bobcat regarded the extended hand with visible calculation, weighing risk against reward with the pragmatic assessment of a predator accustomed to making life or death decisions. Mason remained perfectly still, allowing her to process at her own pace, making no move to encourage or pressure her choice. After several moments of deliberation, she took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with a careful precision. Mason controlled his breathing, keeping it slow and steady, despite the quickening of his pulse. The mother paused just short of his extended hand, her whiskers twitching as she scented both the food and the human offering it. Then, with delicate precision that spoke to her skills as a hunter, she plucked the morsel from his palm, her teeth barely grazing his skin in a contact so light he might have imagined it if not for the visual confirmation of the empty hand she left behind. "Remarkable," Mason breathed, the single word encompassing the entirety of this unprecedented interaction. "Absolutely remarkable." A soft chirping sound drew both their attention to the nest by the stove. The cub had awakened, its amber eyes blinking drowsily as it took in its surroundings. Upon seeing its mother, it let out a more insistent call, struggling to stand on still wobbly legs. The mother immediately returned to her offspring, nudging it gently with her nose in greeting. The cub responded with increased animation, batting playfully at its mother's face, with tiny paws still tipped with claws that had yet to reach their full lethal potential. The mother tolerated this rowdy welcome with apparent patience, occasionally using a gentle paw to subdue the more exuberant movements. The display of ordinary feline behavior, a mother and child engaging in the timeless rituals of their species, struck Mason with its normalcy in such abnormal circumstances. "Someone's feeling better," he observed, smiling at the energetic display that contrasted so sharply with the half-drowned, barely responsive creature he'd pulled from the river. The cub's recovery seemed nothing short of miraculous, though Mason knew it was simply the resilience of youth combined with the dedicated care of its mother throughout the night. The kettle began to steam, drawing Mason's attention back to his coffee preparations. He measured grounds into a metal French press, a small luxury he maintained even in this rustic setting, and poured the hot water, releasing the rich aroma of fresh coffee into the cabin's air. The familiar scent grounded him in routine, a touch of normalcy in a situation that had long since departed from anything resembling ordinary experience. As he waited for the coffee to steep, Mason contemplated the unexpected turn his solitary hike had taken. What had begun as a simple day in the wilderness, a ritual of reconnection with the landscape that had shaped his life, had transformed into something he could scarcely have imagined, an interspecies encounter that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The question now was, what came next? The mother and cub could not, should not, remain in a human dwelling indefinitely. Despite the remarkable trust that had developed, they were wild creatures whose proper place was in the forests and mountains of their natural territory. The cub needed to learn hunting skills, territorial boundaries, the complex knowledge that would ensure its survival in a world that offered no accommodations to the unprepared. These lessons could only be taught in the wilderness, not within the confines of a cabin, regardless of how temporarily comfortable the arrangement might seem. Yet the thought of their departure brought an unexpected pang of regret. Mason had spent the 5 years since Sarah's passing in a kind of emotional hibernation, going through the motions of life without fully engaging with its possibilities. This strange interlude, dangerous, unpredictable, against every protocol of wildlife management he'd ever been taught, had awakened something he'd thought permanently dormant, a sense of connection, of being needed, of participating in something meaningful beyond his own solitary existence. The cub had now managed to stand fully, its balance improving by the minute as strength returned to limbs taxed beyond endurance by its ordeal in the river. It took a tentative step, then another, exploring the towels that had formed its nest throughout the night. The mother watched, attentively, making no move to restrict its explorations, but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. When the cub attempted a more ambitious leap from the towels to the floor, she gently caught it mid-air, redirecting its momentum to ensure a safer landing. Mason poured his coffee into a tin cup, the rich black liquid steaming in the cool morning air. He sipped it gratefully, feeling the caffeine begin to clear the fog of his interrupted night's sleep. Through the window, he could see that the storm had left the forest transformed, branches glistening with residual moisture, the quality of light different as it filtered through air, cleared of dust and pollen by the rain. It would be a good day for his guests to begin their journey home. "I think it's time we started making plans for your departure," he addressed the Bobcats, continuing the habit of one-sided conversation that had developed between them. "That river will have settled down by now, and you probably have a den somewhere that's missing you. Maybe other little ones who need their mother's return." The mention of other cubs was speculation. Bobcats typically gave birth to litters of 1 to 6 kittens, but there was no way to know if this mother had other offspring waiting somewhere in the forest. The thought that she might have abandoned other cubs to focus on saving this one added a poignant dimension to her choices that Mason had not previously considered. The cub had now ventured further from its nest, exploring the wooden floor with increasing confidence. Its movements still showed signs of weakness, a slight tremor in the hind legs, occasional moments of unsteadiness, but the improvement from the previous day was remarkable. Nature's resilience never ceased to amaze Mason, even after decades of witnessing its manifestations throughout his career. As if sensing the direction of his thoughts, the mother bobcat rose and stretched luxuriously, her lithe body extending to its full length before relaxing back into its compact form. She watched her cub's explorations for a moment longer, then turned her attention to the cabin door through which they had entered the previous evening. Her intent was clear even without words. She was ready to return to the world that was her true home. Mason finished his coffee, the familiar ritual providing a moment of normalcy amidst the extraordinary circumstances. He rinsed the cup with water from his canteen and packed away his few belongings with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to wilderness travel. The mother bobcat observed his preparations with evident interest, her amber eyes tracking His movements around the small cabin. The cub, meanwhile, had discovered the joy of pouncing on dust motes that danced in the sunbeams streaming through the window. Its playful antics a stark contrast to its near-lifeless state the previous day. "Looks like someone's feeling their oats this morning," Mason commented, smiling as the cub executed a particularly ambitious leap, landing in an ungraceful tumble before scrambling back to its feet with undiminished enthusiasm. "Good sign that. Nothing heals the body like the spirit deciding it's time to play again." He checked the wood stove, ensuring the fire was properly banked before he departed. The cabin would remain unoccupied until his next visit, but old habits of wilderness stewardship died hard. Fire safety had been drilled into him since his earliest ranger training, a respect for the devastating potential of unchecked flames in the dry mountain landscape. "Well," he addressed his unlikely companions, "I think it's time we all headed back to where we belong. You to your wilderness, me to my slightly less wild but still rather solitary existence in town." The mother bobcat had moved to the door, sitting before it with unmistakable intent. The cub, noticing its mother's changed focus, abandoned its play to wobble over to her side, still unsteady, but showing remarkable improvement with each passing hour. Mason approached slowly, maintaining the deliberate movements that had characterized their unusual interaction. "Let me get that for you," he said, reaching for the door handle, "though I'm not sure how you plan to operate this yourself if I hadn't been here." He swung the door open gently, allowing fresh morning air to flood the cabin. The scent of pine and wet earth swept in, along with the complex symphony of forest sounds. Birds resuming their territories after the storm, the distant gurgle of water finding new pathways down the mountainside, the soft whisper of breeze through needled branches. The mother bobcat's nostrils flared as she processed this influx of sensory information, her whiskers twitching with heightened awareness. To Mason's surprise, she made no immediate move to exit. Instead, she turned her gaze back to him, that same penetrating assessment he'd noted from their first encounter. The cub mirrored its mother's hesitation, pressing close against her forelegs, suddenly shy in the face of the vast forest beyond the cabin door. "It's all right," Mason encouraged, softly. "That's your home out there, where you need to be." Still, the mother remained in place, her behavior defying Mason's expectations once again. After a moment's consideration, he realized the issue might be one of perceived safety. Though the storm had passed, the forest would be transformed. Scents altered by rain, familiar landmarks possibly changed by wind or flooding, the river itself a different entity than it had been before yesterday's deluge. "Tell you what," he offered, gathering his backpack and slinging it over his shoulders, "I'm heading back down the trail anyway. We can walk together for a while until you find a familiar path that suits you." The suggestion, though uncomprehended, in its specifics, seemed to align with the mother's own inclinations. As Mason stepped outside, she finally moved forward, crossing the threshold with deliberate steps, her cub following close behind. On the small clearing before the cabin, she paused again, scanning the surroundings with heightened alertness, ears swiveling to capture sounds from all directions as she processed potential threats or opportunities in the post-storm landscape. Mason waited patiently, giving her time to acclimate. The morning had warmed considerably as the sun climbed higher, burning away the lingering mist that clung to hollows and shadowed places among the trees. The forest dripped with residual moisture, creating a gentle background percussion that accompanied the more deliberate songs of returning birds. After a full minute of assessment, the mother bobcat seemed satisfied with her surroundings and moved forward again, this time with more confidence, though still at a measured pace that accommodated her cub's less certain steps. "That's it," Mason encouraged, falling into step several yards behind them, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You lead, I'll follow." And so began one of the most unusual processions in Mason's long experience with wildlife. A mother Bobcat and her cub setting the pace, with a human bringing up the rear in a complete reversal of the natural order. They moved through the forest in this fashion for nearly 20 minutes, following no path that Mason could discern, but progressing in a generally eastern direction. The mother occasionally paused to scent the air or investigate particular landmarks. A fallen log, a distinctive boulder, a stand of aspens whose white bark stood out starkly against the predominantly coniferous landscape. The cub managed admirably at first, its strength visibly returning with each passing minute in the fresh air and dappled sunlight. But as they continued, Mason noticed its pace slowing, its earlier exuberance giving way to more labored movements. The ordeal in the river had taken a toll that even a night's rest couldn't fully restore, especially in such a young creature. The mother noticed too, pausing more frequently to allow her offspring to rest, occasionally nudging it encouragingly when it seemed reluctant to continue. After one such pause, when the cub seemed particularly exhausted, the mother did something that stopped Mason in his tracks. She turned and looked directly at him, then back at her struggling young one, then again at Mason. The sequence was so deliberate, so clearly communicative, that Mason felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warming day. "What is it?" he asked softly, though he already suspected what she was attempting to convey. The mother approached her cub, nuzzling it gently before looking back at Mason with what he could only interpret as expectation. The message, though impossible in conventional understanding of animal behavior, seemed unmistakable. She wanted his help. "You want me to carry the little one?" Mason asked incredulously, taking a tentative step forward. The mother held her ground, neither retreating from his approach, nor displaying any signs of the aggression that would be normal in such proximity between human and wild predator. The cub looked up at Mason with weary eyes, its earlier playfulness subdued by the exertion of their journey. Moving with exquisite slowness, Mason crouched and extended his hands, palms up, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "If this is what you want, you're going to have to meet me halfway. I'm not going to chase your little one around the forest." As if understanding the implicit request, the mother nudged her cub forward, encouraging it toward Mason's outstretched hands. The young bobcat resisted initially, instinctive wariness asserting itself despite the previous night's shared shelter. But with continued gentle pressure from its mother, it finally took a halting step forward, then another, until it stood trembling just within Mason's reach. "Easy now," Mason murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "I've got you." With a gentleness honed by years of handling injured wildlife in his ranger days, Mason carefully gathered the cub into his hands. It tensed at the contact, but made no attempt to bite or scratch, seeming to take its cues from its mother's unusual calm. Mason lifted it slowly, cradling it against his chest in a secure but non-restrictive hold that supported its weight, while allowing it freedom to move if it chose. "There we go," he soothed, straightening up carefully to avoid any sudden movements that might startle either bobcat. "Light as a feather, aren't you? Though I suspect you'll be quite the handful when you're full grown." The mother watched the entire process with unwavering attention, her body tense but not threatening. When Mason was fully upright, cub securely in his arms, she performed another thorough visual inspection before apparently satisfying herself that her offspring was safely situated. Only then did she turn and resume their journey, though now she moderated her pace even further, frequently looking back to ensure Mason and her cub were following. They continued in this fashion for another half hour, gradually descending toward the valley floor where the Silverstone River flowed more placidly than in its tumultuous upper reaches. Mason's experienced eye noted the subtle changes in vegetation that indicated they were approaching the river again. More willows and cottonwoods interspersed among the pines, undergrowth becoming thicker and more varied as increased water availability supported greater biodiversity. The cub had relaxed in his arms, occasionally lifting its head to observe their surroundings, but mostly conserving its energy, content to be carried through the challenging terrain. Its trust humbled Mason. The warm weight against his chest, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unexpected connections that could form between the most unlikely of companions. As they neared the river, the mother bobcat's pace increased. Slightly, her movements becoming more purposeful as they approached what Mason realized must be familiar territory. They emerged from a stand of aspens to find themselves on a gentle slope overlooking the Silverstone, which had indeed subsided considerably from its storm-swollen rage. The water still ran high and fast, but nothing like the deadly torrent that had nearly claimed the cub's life. The mother paused at the top of the slope, surveying the scene below. Mason came to a stop beside her, giving her space while taking the opportunity to assess their location. They were roughly a mile downstream from where yesterday's drama had unfolded, in an area where the river widened and slowed, creating a more hospitable environment for wildlife seeking water without the dangers of the upper rapids. "Is this home?" Mason asked softly, looking down at the cub in his arms, which had perked up noticeably at the familiar scents and sounds of the place. The mother bobcat moved forward again, leading them down the slope along a narrow game trail that switched back through rocky outcroppings and stands of serviceberry bushes, still heavy with rain from the previous day's storm. Mason followed carefully, mindful of his footing on the slick path while keeping the cub secure against sudden jolts or jarring movements. At the bottom of the slope, the trail leveled out along the riverbank, threading through willow thickets and around massive boulders deposited by long-ago floods. The mother moved with increasing confidence, clearly on home ground now. After another few minutes of travel, she paused before a particular section of riverbank where an ancient cottonwood had partially uprooted, its massive trunk leaning precariously over the water while its exposed roots created a natural hollow. Underneath, the mother disappeared into this hollow, emerging moments later to look expectantly at Mason. He approached slowly, stooping to peer into the darkness beneath the roots. As his eyes adjusted, he made out the distinctive features of a well-established den, a dry, sheltered space lined with grasses and what appeared to be rabbit fur, protected from the elements and predators by the tangled barrier of roots above. And around it, "So this is home," Mason acknowledged, a sense of completion settling over him. "A fine place for raising a family. Secure, close to water, good hunting in these thickets, I'd imagine." The mother made a soft chirping sound, and the cub in Mason's arms responded immediately, squirming with renewed energy. Taking the cue, Mason carefully lowered himself to one knee and gently set the young bobcat on the ground at the den's entrance. It wobbled momentarily, then regained its balance, looking up at Mason with those remarkable amber eyes before turning and hobbling into the den with more enthusiasm than coordination. Mason straightened, a strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy washing over him. The adventure was ending, the brief, impossible connection between his world and theirs reaching its natural conclusion. Yet there was rightness in this moment too. The restoration of proper order, the return of wild things to their wild places. "Well," he said to the mother, who remained just outside the den, watching him with that same inscrutable intelligence, "I suppose this is goodbye. Take good care of that little fighter of yours. Something tells me you've got quite the survivor. On your hands." He turned to leave, intending to begin the long hike back to the trailhead where his truck was parked, a journey that would likely take most of the remaining daylight given his circuitous route from the cabin. He had gone perhaps 5 steps when a soft sound behind him made him pause and look back. The mother bobcat stood at the entrance to her den, her posture communicating an intensity that held Mason motionless. For several heartbeats, they regarded each other across the short distance he had managed to create between them. Then with deliberate steps, she approached him once more, her movements displaying none of the wariness that should characterize a wild predator in human presence. When she reached a point just 3 feet away, she paused, her amber eyes holding his with unwavering focus. Mason remained perfectly still, uncertain what this final interaction might entail, but unwilling to break the moment with hasty movement. The forest around them had fallen into one of those rare moments of absolute stillness, the birds momentarily silent, the breeze holding its breath, even the river's constant murmur seeming to recede from conscious awareness. In this pocket of suspended time, the mother bobcat did something that Mason would remember with crystal clarity for the remainder of his days. She lowered her head in a gesture unmistakably similar to a bow, held the position for 3 distinct seconds, then raised her eyes again to meet his. Without waiting for a response, she turned and padded silently back to her den, disappearing into the shadows beneath the cottonwood roots where her cub awaited. Mason stood frozen, the simple yet profound gesture reverberating through him like the aftershock of an earthquake. In his decades of wildlife experience, he had never witnessed, indeed had never imagined, such behavior from a wild animal. There was no biological or scientific framework that could adequately explain what had just occurred. Yet the meaning felt undeniable, transcending the barriers of species and language, acknowledgement, recognition, perhaps even gratitude. "You're welcome," he whispered into the renewed silence of the forest, the words feeling simultaneously inadequate and exactly right. With a deep breath that seemed to mark the transition from the extraordinary back to the ordinary, Mason adjusted his backpack's straps and turned toward the path that would lead him home. The interlude with the bobcats already felt dreamlike in its improbability, yet the mud caked on his clothes and the lingering ache in his muscles from the river rescue provided tangible evidence of the reality he had experienced. He hiked steadily through the afternoon, retracing his route along the Silverstone until he found the main trail that would lead him back to the trailhead. The forest seemed different somehow, not just in the physical changes wrought by the storm, but in some more fundamental way that Mason struggled to articulate even to himself. It was as if the lens through which he viewed the wilderness had been subtly recalibrated, revealing dimensions and possibilities previously overlooked. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridgeline when Mason finally emerged from the forest path into the small gravel parking area where his weathered blue pickup truck waited. His body protested as he climbed into the driver's seat, muscles stiffening after the sustained exertion of the past 24 hours. Yet, beneath the physical discomfort lay a curious sense of renewal, as if something long dormant had reawakened within him during his unexpected adventure. Starting the engine, Mason took one last look at the forest edge before pulling onto the narrow road that would lead him back to Pinecrest, the small mountain town he had called home since retiring from active ranger service. The bobcats were lost to sight now, returned to the secret life of the wilderness where they belonged, but the connection forged between them, impossible, brief, yet undeniably real, remained with him. A private talisman against the solitude that had been his constant companion since Sarah's passing. The drive to Pinecrest took nearly an hour along winding mountain roads, still bearing evidence of the previous day's storm. Debris scattered across asphalt, the occasional branch down in the roadway, requiring careful navigation. Mason's thoughts drifted as he drove, replaying the extraordinary sequence of events that had begun with a solitary hike and culminated in that enigmatic gesture of acknowledgement beside the river. There was a story here, he realized, one worth preserving beyond his own memory. His modest home sat on the outskirts of town, a single-story cabin-style structure on 2 acres of pinyon and juniper woodland that provided a buffer between himself and his nearest neighbors. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, Mason noted with mild surprise that the porch light was on, despite the fact that dusk had not yet fully descended. Then he spotted the familiar red SUV parked to one side of his house and smiled, understanding. Dawning Emma Spencer, his stepdaughter from Sarah's first marriage, must have come by to check on him. She lived in the city 2 hours away, but made a point of visiting at least twice a month. Her concern for his solitary existence manifesting in regular supply drops and gentle but persistent reminders that isolation wasn't mandatory even for a confirmed wilderness lover like himself. Sure enough, as he parked and stepped wearily from his truck, the front door opened to reveal Emma's tall figure, silhouetted against the warm light from within. At 38, she had her mother's height and slender build, though her dark hair and olive complexion came from her biological father. What she shared with Sarah most prominently was a fierce, protective instinct toward those she considered family, a category in which she had unequivocally included Mason even after her mother's death. "There you are," she called, relief evident in her voice. "I was starting to worry when I got here and found the place empty. Tried calling, but no signal, as usual." Mason raised a hand in greeting, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. Clothes still bearing the dried mud and debris from his river adventure, a day's growth of stubble on his face, likely looking every bit the wild man of the mountains. Emma occasionally teased him about becoming. "Had a bit of an adventure," he replied, climbing the 3 steps to the porch with joints that protested each elevation change. "Nothing serious, but a longer hike than I'd planned." Emma's expression shifted from relief to concerned assessment as she took in his bedraggled state. "Adventure, huh? Is that what we're calling it when a 62-year-old man disappears into the wilderness during a flash flood warning and comes back looking like he went 10 rounds with the mountain itself?" The gentle scolding carried no real heat, just the familiar concern that characterized their relationship. Her perpetual worry that his solitude might cross the line into recklessness. His constant reassurance that decades of wilderness experience provided safeguards she couldn't fully appreciate. "Come inside," she continued, holding the door wider. "There's beef stew in the crock pot. I figured you might need a decent meal after whatever adventure you've been having. And a hot shower wouldn't hurt either from the looks of you." Mason followed her inside, the familiar comfort of his home, enveloping him like a physical embrace. Emma had obviously been busy during her wait. The usual light layer of dust was gone from the surfaces. A vase of fresh wildflowers brightened the kitchen table, and the lingering scent of pine cleaner mingled with the rich aroma of beef stew simmering on the counter. "You didn't have to clean," he remarked, setting his backpack down by the door, "or cook, though I won't pretend I'm not grateful for both." Emma waved away his protest with a familiar gesture inherited directly from her mother. "It gave me something to do while I waited and worried about you being swept away in a flash flood or falling off a cliff somewhere. Besides, this place could use a woman's touch occasionally." She paused, studying his face more carefully. "There's something different about you." Mason raised his eyebrows. "Different how?" "I'm not sure exactly." She tilted her head, the gesture reminiscent of another female who had studied him with similar intensity just hours earlier. "You look, I don't know, more present somehow, less like you're going through the motions." A small smile touched her lips. "Whatever adventure you had out there, it seems to have done you some good." Mason considered deflecting with their usual light banter, but something in her honest assessment deserved equal honesty in return. "I think maybe it did," he acknowledged quietly. "I helped someone today. Something. And it mattered." Emma's expression softened. "Of course it mattered. You matter, Mason. That's what Mom always tried to tell you, even when you were determined. To believe your only value was in the job." The gentle rebuke struck closer to home than she could know. Since retiring, Mason had indeed struggled to find purpose beyond the ranger identity that had defined him for 3 decades. Sarah had seen it clearly, her final years filled with efforts to help him envision a future where his worth wasn't measured solely by trails maintained or hikers rescued or wildfires contained. He hadn't made it easy for her, his stubborn self-sufficiency, a poor disguise for the fear of irrelevance that haunted his transition to civilian life. Go shower, Emma directed, breaking into his momentary introspection. Food will be ready when you are, and you can tell me all about this mysterious adventure that's put that look in your eyes. 20 minutes later, clean and changed into fresh clothes, Mason sat across from his stepdaughter at the small kitchen table, a bowl of hearty stew steaming before him. The hot shower had eased some of the stiffness from his muscles, though. He knew from experience that tomorrow would bring the full reckoning for his body's exceptional exertions. "So," Emma prompted, after he'd taken several appreciative bites of the stew, "are you going to tell me what happened out there? Or do I have to guess? Because my imagination is already running wild with possibilities involving mountain lions and bear cubs, and you playing wilderness superhero again." Mason chuckled, appreciating her attempt to lighten what she clearly sensed was a significant experience for him. Not far off, actually, though no bears or mountain lions this time. He took another bite, gathering his thoughts. It was bobcats, a mother and her cub. Emma's eyes widened. "Bobcats? You actually saw them? Mom would have been so jealous. She was always hoping to spot one on your hikes." "More than saw them," Mason corrected, setting down his spoon. "I interacted with them, saved the cub from drowning in the Silverstone during the worst of the storm surge." As the words left his mouth, Mason realized how fantastical the story would sound. Bobcats were notoriously elusive, rarely spotted even by experienced outdoors people who spent their lives in suitable habitat. To claim not only multiple sightings, but actual physical interaction and rescue was the kind of tale that would normally elicit polite skepticism at best, outright disbelief at worst. Emma's expression confirmed his expectation, initial surprise giving way to the careful neutrality of someone not wanting to challenge a story they found implausible. "Wow, Mason, that must have been intense." "You don't believe me," he stated without rancor, understanding her reaction completely. "Can't say I blame you. I'm not sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it." "It's not that. I don't believe you saw bobcats," Emma clarified diplomatically. "That's rare but certainly possible. It's just the rest of it sounds like something from a nature documentary, not real life. Wild predators don't typically allow humans to approach. They're young, let alone rescue them." Mason nodded, acknowledging the rational foundation of her doubt. "Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right. That's what made this so extraordinary. The circumstances were anything but normal." Encouraged by her attentive silence, Mason began recounting the full tale, starting with his decision to hike despite the threatening weather and continuing through each remarkable phase of his encounter with the bobcats. As he spoke, his natural storytelling ability, honed through years of campfire tales for junior rangers and visitor groups, transformed the experience into a vivid narrative that Emma followed with increasing engagement. He described the mother's desperate cries that had first drawn his attention, the sight of the struggling cub in the raging river, his impulsive decision to attempt a rescue despite the obvious dangers. He detailed the harrowing swim, the precarious moments when failure seemed certain, the final exhausting crawl to safety with the cub clutched protectively against him. Throughout the telling, he was careful to stick to exactly what had happened, neither embellishing for dramatic effect nor downplaying the exceptional nature of the wild animal's behavior. When he reached the part about the mother bobcat entering his cabin voluntarily, Emma's expression had shifted from polite attention to genuine wonderment. By the time he described the mother allowing him to carry her weakened cub through the forest, her skepticism had given way to open amazement. And when he recounted that final, inexplicable bow beside the river, Emma's eyes shone with the same emotion that had overwhelmed Mason himself in that moment. "That's," she began, then shook her head, searching for adequate words. "I've never heard anything like it. If anyone else told me this story, I'd think they were pulling my leg or had been out in the sun too long. But you've never been one for tall tales or exaggeration." Mason smiled faintly at Emma's assessment. "No, I've never had much talent for fiction. Don't have the imagination for it. This happened exactly as I've described, though I'm still trying to make sense of it myself." Emma leaned back in her chair, her half-eaten stew forgotten as she processed his extraordinary tale. "It's like something from those books Mom used to love. Those stories about profound connections between humans and wild animals. She was always drawn to them, always believed they contained some deeper truth beneath the sentimentality." She shook her head in wonderment. "And here you are, living one of those stories in real life." "Sarah would have understood it better than I do," Mason admitted, the mention of his late wife bringing both warmth and the familiar ache to his chest. "She always had a more intuitive grasp of these things. I'm still stuck in my ranger training, trying to find scientific explanations for behaviors that don't fit any wildlife management textbook I've ever read." "Have you considered that maybe there isn't a scientific explanation?" Emma suggested, gently. "Maybe some experiences just transcend our usual frameworks for understanding the world." Mason contemplated her words, turning them over in his mind, alongside the vivid memories of the past 24 hours. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on a rational, evidence-based approach to nature, appreciating its beauty and power while maintaining the clear-eyed perspective necessary for effective conservation work. Mystical interpretations of natural phenomena had always struck him as unnecessary when ecology and evolutionary biology provided such elegant explanations for the behaviors he observed. Yet his encounter with the bobcats resisted categorization within those familiar frameworks. The mother's behavior in particular, her willingness to enter a human dwelling, her apparent trust in allowing him to handle her cub, that final, inexplicable gesture of acknowledgement, pushed beyond the boundaries of what could be readily explained by adaptive strategies or instinctive responses. "Maybe you're right," he conceded finally. "Not everything needs to be dissected and classified to be meaningful. Whatever happened out there, whatever prompted that mother bobcat to act as she did, it felt significant. Like I was being granted access to something usually hidden from human experience." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think you'll see them again?" The question caught Mason by surprise, though he realized it had been lurking at the edges of his consciousness since leaving the bobcats at their den. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Conventional wisdom would say no. Bobcats are territorial but secretive, and even if I returned to the same area, the chances of another encounter would be extremely slim." He paused, remembering the intelligence in those amber eyes, the deliberate quality of each interaction, but there was nothing conventional about this experience from the beginning, so maybe a comfortable silence fell between them, the kind possible only between people who have shared enough life to be at ease in wordless company. Outside, dusk had deepened into true darkness, the forest beyond Mason's windows transforming into the mysterious nocturnal realm where creatures like the bobcats came into their own. "You should write it down," Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The whole experience exactly as you told it to me." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Write it down? Why?" "For several reasons," she replied, warming to the idea. "First, because It's an extraordinary wildlife encounter worth documenting, even if just for your own records. Second, because Mom would have loved this story more than anything, and writing it would be a way of sharing it with her somehow. She hesitated, then added more softly, and third, because I think it might help you process what happened, to find whatever meaning is there for you in this experience. Mason considered her suggestion, surprising himself with how appealing he found the idea. Though he had kept detailed field journals during his ranger days, those had been primarily scientific in nature. Species sightings, habitat conditions, weather patterns, management recommendations. The kind of narrative Emma was suggesting would be different, more personal, perhaps even verging on the territory of what Sarah had sometimes gently teased him for dismissing as nature writing. "I'm not much of a writer," he demurred, though without real conviction. "My reports were always factual but hardly compelling reading." Emma smiled knowingly. "That's not true, and you know it. Mom always said you had a gift for storytelling. She used to brag about how you could hold an entire group of hikers spellbound with your explanations of forest ecology or wildlife behavior. You just told me this entire Bobcat saga in a way that made me see every moment as if I'd been there myself. That's writing, Mason, just with your voice instead of on paper." Her confidence in his abilities warmed him, as did the reminder of Sarah's belief in talents he had never fully acknowledged in himself. "Maybe I'll give it a try," he conceded. "No guarantees on the quality, mind you. No pressure for a Pulitzer." Emma replied with a gentle tease in her voice. "Just the truth as you experienced it. That's all any good writing needs to be." As they finished their meal and cleared the dishes together, the conversation shifted to more ordinary matters. Emma's work as an environmental attorney in the city, her ongoing renovation of the small bungalow she had purchased the previous year, mutual acquaintances from the years when Sarah had been the center of both their lives. Yet beneath the comfortable domestic routine, Mason felt a subtle but significant shift in his perspective, as if the extraordinary events of the past day had adjusted something fundamental in how he viewed not just the wilderness, but his place within it. Later, after Emma had departed with promises to return the following weekend, Mason found himself drawn to the small desk in the corner of his living room. It had been Sarah's writing space originally, the place where she had penned countless nature observations, personal reflections, and the occasional article for local environmental publications. Since her passing, he had maintained it as a kind of shrine, dusting it regularly, but rarely sitting in the comfortable chair she had positioned to catch the morning light through the eastern window. Tonight, however, he settled into that chair with a sense of rightness, as if completing a circle that had begun with his impulsive decision to hike despite threatening weather. From the desk drawer, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, a gift from Sarah on their 30th anniversary that he had never used, reluctant to mar its pristine pages with his utilitarian field notes. Now, it seemed the perfect vessel for this story that had been entrusted to him by circumstance or fate or simple wild chance. For nearly 2 hours, Mason wrote steadily, his ranger's attention to detail serving him well as he reconstructed the experience from first awareness of the storm to that final haunting moment of acknowledgement beside the river. He found himself drawing on skills honed through decades of observation but rarely applied to narrative. His ability to recall visual details with photographic precision, his sensitivity to the nuances of animal behavior, his deep familiarity with the forest ecosystem that had formed the backdrop to the extraordinary encounter. The writing came more easily than he had expected, the events still so vivid in his mind that transferring them to paper felt almost like transcription rather than creation. He made no attempt to explain or analyze what had happened, focusing instead on capturing the experience itself in all its vivid, perplexing detail. Explanations could come later if they came at all. For now, bearing witness seemed enough. As he neared the end of his account, Mason found himself adding something he hadn't mentioned even to Emma. A reflection on what the experience had awakened. In him, a sense of connection and purpose that had been dormant since his retirement, perhaps even earlier. The ranger in him had always understood his role as a steward of the wilderness, a protector and interpreter of natural systems too vast and complex for any single human to fully comprehend. But this encounter had suggested a different kind of relationship, one based not on professional responsibility, but on personal engagement, not on management, but on mutual recognition across the boundaries of species. He finished writing just after midnight, his hand cramped from the unaccustomed exercise, but his mind clearer than it had been in months. Closing the journal, he ran his fingers over the soft leather cover, feeling as if he had completed an important task, though to what end he couldn't yet say. The events he had recorded defied easy categorization or explanation, but perhaps their value lay precisely in that resistance to familiar frameworks. Some experiences were meant to be wondered at rather than understood, to raise questions rather than provide answers. Outside his window, an owl called into the darkness, its hollow, haunting notes a reminder of the nocturnal world, now fully ascendant. Mason thought of the mother bobcat and her cub, perhaps hunting in the moonlight, filtering through the forest canopy. Their brief intersection with his human life already receding into memory for them while remaining vivid and transformative for him. The asymmetry of the relationship struck him as both poignant and appropriate. Humans seeking meaning and connection, wild creatures simply being what they were, their profundity unintentional but no less real for that. Sleep beckoned, his body demanding rest after the extraordinary exertions of the past day. But as Mason prepared for bed, moving through his nightly routine with the habitual efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, he found himself pausing by the window that faced east toward the mountains. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, the bobcats continued their secret lives, unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, the impact their brief presence had made on the human who had intervened in their story. Or were they truly unaware? That final gesture by the mother, the deliberate lowering of her head, the direct eye contact, the precise timing that suggested intentionality rather than coincidence, challenged his lifelong understanding of the boundaries between human and wild awareness. He had no framework for interpreting that moment, except the one that felt intuitively, inescapably true. She had recognized him not just as a physical presence, but as an individual who had altered the course of her life and her offspring's. And in that recognition lay something profound about the interconnectedness of all living things, a truth he had understood intellectually throughout his career, but had rarely felt with such visceral certainty. With that thought lingering in his mind, Mason finally surrendered to exhaustion, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep unmarked by the restlessness that had characterized so many nights since Sarah's passing. His body needed recovery, and for once, his mind allowed it, the turbulence of grief and uncertainty temporarily calmed by the day's extraordinary events. The following week passed in a rhythm familiar to Mason's post-retirement life. Volunteer, work at the local nature center, maintenance projects around his property, solitary hikes in the less remote areas of the surrounding forest. Yet beneath the surface of these routine activities, a subtle but significant shift had occurred. The experience with the bobcats had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long, a sense of wonder, of openness to the unexpected, of connection to the natural world, not as an abstract ecosystem to be managed, but as a living reality in which he remained an active participant. He found himself watching the forest with renewed attention, noticing details that had faded into the background of familiar observation. The particular quality of light filtering through pine needles at different times of day, the complex social interactions of chickadees at his bird feeder, the intricate patterns of lichen spreading across boulders at the edge of his property. The world seemed more vibrant somehow, infused with possibilities beyond the rational frameworks that had ordered his professional life. On the seventh day after his encounter with the bobcats, Mason woke before dawn with a clarity of purpose that felt both surprising and inevitable. He would return to the river, to the place where the mother and cub had disappeared into their den beneath the cottonwood roots. Not with any expectation of seeing them again. He was too experienced a naturalist to anticipate such astronomical odds, but as a pilgrimage of sorts, an acknowledgement of the significance that place now held in his personal geography. The morning was cool and clear, the sky transitioning from pearl grey to pale blue as he drove the now familiar route to the trailhead. Unlike his previous visit, today he packed deliberately for a full day in the field. Extra water, high-protein snacks, first aid supplies, even the small camera he had rarely used since retirement. If this was to be a pilgrimage, he would document it properly, creating a record that might someday complement the written account already filling pages in Sarah's leather-bound journal. The forest welcomed him with the fresh scents of early autumn. Pine, resin warming in the strengthening sun, a hint of decay from fallen leaves beginning their transformation into soil, the clean mineral tang of the river growing stronger as he approached its course. He hiked steadily, his body still bearing some residual soreness from his previous adventure, but moving with the efficient rhythm of a man comfortable in wilderness terrain. The familiar trail felt different somehow, transformed not by any physical change, but by the memories now layered upon its winding path. Mason moved at a deliberate pace, allowing himself to absorb the forest's subtle rhythms without the urgency that had driven his previous journey. Birds called from the canopy above, nuthatches, chickadees, the occasional raven, their voices creating a complex soundtrack to his solitary progress. A light breeze stirred the pine boughs, releasing their resinous scent into the morning air. As he approached the river, Mason noted how dramatically its character had changed since the storm. What had been a raging torrent was now a relatively placid flow, still swollen slightly beyond its normal boundaries, but nothing like the deadly force that had nearly claimed the bobcat cub's life. The Silverstone had returned to its more benevolent persona, the Jekyll to the Hyde he had battled in those desperate moments of rescue. Mason followed the river downstream, orienting himself by landmarks he had noted during his previous visit, a distinctive stand of aspens, a boulder shaped vaguely like a bear's head, the lightning-scarred trunk of a ponderosa pine that had survived some long-ago storm. The forest opened up in places to reveal small meadows, where late summer wildflowers still offered splashes of color against the predominant green and brown palette of the landscape. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Mason recognized the slope that led down to the section of riverbank where the bobcat's den was located. He paused at the top of the incline, surveying the scene below with a mixture of anticipation and realism. The odds of actually encountering the bobcats again were astronomically small. Wild animals, especially predators as elusive as bobcats, rarely maintained patterns predictable enough for human observation. The mother might have moved her cub to a different den after his intrusion, following the natural caution that had helped her species survive millennia of coexistence with more dominant predators, including humans. Yet something drew him forward, down the switchbacking game trail that led to the river's edge. Not expectation exactly, but a kind of openness to possibility that felt new in his experience of the wilderness. For most of his career, Mason had approached nature with the systematic focus of a trained professional, recording observations, analyzing patterns, making management recommendations based on accumulated data. There had been wonder in that approach, certainly, but a wonder contained within rational boundaries, always secondary to the practical work of conservation. Now, as he descended toward the riverbank, Mason felt those familiar boundaries shifting, allowing room for experiences that might defy easy categorization or explanation. The transformation wasn't about abandoning his scientific understanding that remained the solid foundation of his relationship with the natural world. Rather, it was about creating space alongside that understanding for moments that might transcend. Connections that might emerge from some deeper, more intuitive engagement with the living systems around him. The uprooted cottonwood came into view as Mason reached the bottom of the slope, its massive trunk still leaning precariously over the water, roots exposed to create the natural hollow where he had last seen the mother and cub disappear. He approached, slowly, making no attempt to conceal his presence, but moving with the quiet respect that had characterized his professional interactions with wildlife throughout his career. From 20 feet away, he could see that the den entrance appeared undisturbed, neither deliberately concealed nor obviously abandoned. Fresh tracks marked the mud at the river's edge nearby. Deer, raccoon, what might have been coyote, but nothing he could definitively identify as bobcat. The area was quiet except for the gentle sound of water moving past and the occasional call of a belted kingfisher patrolling the river upstream. Mason settled on a fallen log about 30 feet from the den, a distance that felt respectful of the boundary between his human presence and the wild space he was visiting. He had no real plan beyond simply being here, allowing whatever might happen to unfold without expectation or demand. From his backpack, he withdrew a small journal, not Sarah's leather-bound gift, but a more utilitarian field notebook he had, carried throughout his ranger days. Old habits reasserted themselves as he began noting the date, time, weather conditions, and wildlife signs visible from his position. The mundane act of recording observations grounded him, providing a familiar structure within which he could process the less familiar emotional landscape of this return visit. There was a kind of meditation in the careful documentation of natural details, water levels, plant conditions, animal signs that had always centered him during his professional life and continued to serve that purpose now, bridging the gap between his ranger past and his still evolving present. An hour passed in this quiet observation, the sun climbing higher to cast dappled patterns through the forest canopy onto the ground around him. Mason had just closed his notebook, considering whether to continue his hike farther downstream, when a flicker of movement near the water's edge caught his attention. He stilled, eyes tracking to the source of the motion with the practiced focus of a lifelong wildlife observer. At first, he saw nothing beyond the gentle stirring of willow branches in the light breeze. Then, like a shadow separating itself from other shadows, a form materialized at the river's edge, tawny, compact, moving with the distinctive fluid grace that belonged to only one animal in these mountains. The mother bobcat had emerged downriver, approximately 50 yards from where Mason sat motionless on his fallen log. His breath caught in his throat, the familiar surge of wonder that accompanied any wildlife sighting amplified by the personal connection he felt to this particular animal. She was hunting, her attention focused on the water's edge, where small creatures might be found among the rocks and vegetation. Each movement was a study in efficiency and precision, her powerful body held in perfect balance as she stalked along. The shoreline. Mason made no attempt to alert her to his presence, content simply to witness this natural behavior from an unobtrusive distance. Through decades in the wilderness, he had developed the patience necessary for true observation, the ability to remain perfectly still, to subordinate personal comfort to the opportunity for genuine insight into the lives of wild creatures going about their business, undisturbed by human interference. The mother bobcat continued her patrol of the shoreline, pausing occasionally to investigate promising spots with delicate paw movements. that belied the power contained in those same limbs. She seemed healthy, her coat glossy in the morning sunlight, movements displaying none of the desperate urgency that had characterized their previous encounter. This was a predator in her element, confident and competent in the environment shaped by millennia of evolutionary adaptation. After several minutes of intent focus on the shoreline, she suddenly froze, body tensing in the distinctive posture of a cat that has located prey. For 3 heartbeats, she remained absolutely motionless, then launched forward in an explosive blur of movement that ended with her forepaws plunging into shallow water. When she withdrew them, Mason could just make out something clutched in her jaws, a small fish perhaps, or a frog caught at the river's edge. The successful hunt completed, the mother bobcat turned away from the water, her prize secure. It was then, in what seemed an impossible coincidence that Mason knew might not be coincidence at all, that she first became aware of his presence. Her head lifted, nose testing the air, ears swiveling to locate the source of whatever trace of human scent had reached her acute senses. Mason remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing as the wild predator processed this new information. He expected her to vanish immediately, the natural wariness of her species asserting itself at the detection of a potential threat. That was the normal pattern of such encounters. A brief, privileged glimpse, followed by the animal's swift retreat into the safety of concealment. But normal patterns had ceased to apply from the moment he had first heard her desperate cries for her drowning cub. Now, instead of the expected retreat, the mother bobcat took several deliberate steps in his direction, her amber eyes fixing on his position with unmistakable recognition. The prey item still dangled from her jaws, apparently forgotten as she focused on this unexpected encounter. At 30 yards distance, she paused, setting down her catch on the ground before her. Mason could now see it was indeed a fish, its scales catching the sunlight in brief flashes of silver. The mother bobcat looked from the fish to Mason, then back to the fish, in a sequence that struck him as oddly deliberate. Then, with movements that displayed none of the tension or wariness one would expect, she nudged the fish forward with her nose before taking several steps backward, her eyes never leaving Mason's face. The behavior was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Mason knew about wild predator conduct, that for several moments he simply stared in disbelief. It was only when she repeated the sequence, nudging the fish forward again before taking another step back, that understanding began to dawn, an understanding so extraordinary that his rational mind initially rejected it even as a deeper intuition, embraced its apparent meaning. She was offering him the fish. There could be no other interpretation of the deliberate sequence of behaviors, the directness of her attention, the purposeful placement of the prey, the clear yielding of possession, indicated by her retreat from the offering. In the complex calculus of wild survival, where each calorie represented life-sustaining energy, she was voluntarily relinquishing food to him. Mason's training as a wildlife biologist provided no framework for this behavior. Wild predators might cache food for later retrieval, might share with offspring or occasionally with mates, but they did not offer food to members of another species, particularly not to potential predators like humans. There was no evolutionary advantage to such behavior, no logical explanation within standard models of animal cognition or social structure. Yet the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. Something unprecedented was occurring in this quiet corner of the wilderness, something that transcended the boundaries of conventional understanding about the relationship between humans and wild animals. The mother bobcat maintained her position, watching him with that same unnerving intelligence he had noted during their first encounter, clearly waiting for some response to her extraordinary gesture. Moving with exquisite slowness to avoid any appearance of threat, Mason rose from his seated position on the log. The mother bobcat tensed slightly but held her ground, her attention unwavering as he took a single step forward, then another, gradually decreasing the distance between them. At 15 yards, he stopped, instinct telling him this was the appropriate boundary to respect. Close enough to acknowledge her offering, but not so close as to transform the encounter from mutual recognition to potential confrontation. "Chat, you," he said softly, the words feeling simultaneously inadequate and exactly right for this moment that defied conventional categorization. As if his voice had completed some necessary circuit of communication, the mother bobcat relaxed visibly, sitting back on her haunches in a posture that displayed neither fear nor aggression, simply a calm acceptance of his presence in her territory. For nearly a full minute, they regarded each other across the diminishing space, wild animal and human, locked in a moment of connection that Mason knew he would spend years trying to fully comprehend. Then, with the same deliberate quality that had characterized all her interactions with him, the mother bobcat rose and turned toward the den beneath the cottonwood roots. At its entrance, she paused, looking back at Mason with what he could only interpret as expectation. The message, though impossible according to everything he had been taught about wildlife behavior, seemed unmistakable. She was inviting him to follow, heart pounding with a mixture of awe and the natural caution of an experienced wilderness professional. Mason considered his response. Every protocol of wildlife management warned against following a wild predator, particularly one returning to a den that might contain vulnerable young. Yet every instinct honed through his extraordinary experiences with this particular animal told him that normal protocols had ceased to apply from the moment he had first intervened in the river's attempt to claim her cub. Decision made, Mason began walking slowly toward the den, maintaining a respectful distance behind the mother bobcat, who had resumed her progress once she saw him following. They moved in this unusual procession along the riverbank, past the entrance to the hollow beneath the cottonwood roots, where he had last seen the cub, continuing along a narrow game trail that skirted the water's edge before turning slightly inland toward a rocky outcropping partially concealed by dense juniper growth. The mother bobcat navigated this path with familiar ease, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Mason was still following. For his part, he moved carefully, attention divided between watching his footing on the uneven ground and maintaining visual contact with his unprecedented guide. The surreal quality of the experience was tempered by the solid reality of the forest around him, the scent of juniper and river water, the feel of sunlight warm on his shoulders, the sound of a raven calling somewhere overhead. At the base of the rocky outcropping, the mother bobcat disappeared into a narrow opening between boulders that Mason might have overlooked entirely, if not for her direct line of approach. She emerged moments later without the fish, confirming his growing suspicion about the purpose of this extraordinary journey. This was no longer the original den he had visited before. This was a new location, one to which she had apparently relocated her surviving cub after their previous encounter, and she had deliberately led him to it. Mason approached the opening, cautiously, crouching to peer into the shadows between the rocks. As his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, shapes began to materialize from the darkness, the contours of a small chamber created by the natural arrangement of fallen boulders, lined with what appeared to be dried grasses and perhaps rabbit fur, similar to the original den beneath the cottonwood. And there, in the center of this carefully prepared space, was the cub, not alone, but accompanied by a second young bobcat of approximately the same size. Twins. The realization struck Mason with the force of sudden insight. The mother had not had one cub, but two. The one he had rescued from the river, and the one before him now, both alive, both apparently thriving despite the near tragedy that had almost claimed one of their number. The rescued cub was not present, perhaps already exploring the world beyond the den as its strength returned. But its sibling regarded Mason with bright, curious eyes that contained none of the fear one would expect from a wild juvenile encountering a human for the first time. The mother bobcat made a soft, chirping sound, moving past Mason to enter the den and deposit the fish before her remaining offspring. The young bobcat immediately pounced on the offering, baby teeth tearing at the flesh with enthusiastic, if somewhat uncoordinated efforts that spoke to its still-developing hunting skills. The mother watched this feeding for a moment before turning her attention back to Mason, who remained crouched at the den entrance, overwhelmed by the privilege of witnessing this private moment in the secret life of creatures known for their elusiveness and solitude. "You're showing me your family," he said softly, the words emerging from someplace deeper than conscious thought. "Letting me see that both your little ones are safe." There was no rational reason for her to do this. Indeed, every instinct of a wild mother should be pushing her to conceal her vulnerable offspring from potential predators, particularly humans, whose impact on wildlife was so often destructive rather than benevolent. Yet here she was, deliberately revealing her most precious secret, granting him access to a vulnerability that defied all conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. The only explanation that made any sense, though it pushed against the boundaries of scientific paradigms Mason had operated within throughout his career, was that this was an act of trust. More than that, an act of reciprocity, an acknowledgement of the balance created when he had risked his own safety to save her cub from drowning. In the complex calculus of wild existence, a debt had been created, and she was responding in the only way available to her, by sharing the success his intervention had made possible. Mason remained perfectly still at the den entrance, scarcely daring to breathe as he absorbed the profound significance of what was happening. The young bobcat inside had finished with the fish and was now grooming itself with the meticulous attention typical of felines, seemingly unbothered by the human presence that should, by all natural laws, have triggered immediate fear and retreat. The mother watched both her offspring and Mason with equal attention, her relaxed posture betraying none of the tension that would normally characterize a wild predator in such proximity to humans. "This defies everything I thought I knew," Mason whispered, not expecting comprehension, but feeling compelled to acknowledge aloud the extraordinary nature of the moment. A soft rustling from deeper within the den caught his attention. From the shadows emerged a second small form, the rescued cub, distinguishable from its sibling by a slight unevenness in its gait, perhaps a lingering effect of its traumatic experience in the river. It approached cautiously, whiskers twitching as it processed Mason's scent, amber eyes studying him with an intensity that seemed beyond its young age. Recognition flickered in those eyes, not the complex cognitive recognition of human consciousness, but something more instinctive yet no less real. This was the creature he had cradled against his chest during that desperate swim to shore. The tiny body he had felt trembling with cold and fear as he fought the current. Now it stood before him, still small but visibly stronger, the fragility of near death replaced by the resilient vitality of youth. The cub took another hesitant step forward, then another, gradually closing the distance between them until it stood barely 2 feet from where Mason crouched at the den entrance. The mother made no move to intercede, watching this interaction with what Mason could only interpret as deliberate permissiveness. The moment hung suspended, human and wild creature regarding each other across a divide, both physical and metaphysical. Separate species with separate destinies, yet connected by a shared experience that had temporarily bridged the gap between their worlds. Then, with a suddenness that startled Mason despite his lifetime of wildlife encounters, the cub closed the final distance between them. Before he could process what was happening, it pressed briefly against his outstretched hand. A fleeting contact over in less than a second, but unmistakable in its intentionality. The gesture seemed to hold echoes of the mother's behavior during their night in the cabin. That moment when she had briefly touched her forehead to his knee, in a gesture that defied conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. Mason's breath caught in his throat, emotion tightening his chest as he remained motionless, allowing the cub to retreat at its own pace, back to the security of its mother's side. The simple touch contained multitudes, acknowledgement perhaps, or some bobcat equivalent of the gratitude humans might feel in similar circumstances. Whatever its meaning in the complex inner world of the wild creature, its effect on Mason was profound, a physical confirmation of the connection he had sensed but scarcely dared believe in. "You remember," he said softly, the words barely audible even to his own ears. "Somehow you remember." The mother bobcat made a quiet sound, not quite a purr, not quite a chirp, but something between that seemed to resonate with meaning beyond the simple vocalization. She nudged her rescued cub gently, guiding it back toward its sibling in the deeper security of the den. The message seemed clear, even across the species barrier that separated them. The visit was concluded, the private moment of connection complete. Understanding, Mason began to withdraw, moving backward with the same deliberate slowness that had characterized his approach. The mother watched his retreat, making no move to follow but maintaining her attentive focus until he had reached a distance of about 10 yards from the den entrance. Only then did she finally turn away, disappearing into the shadowed space between the rocks to rejoin her offspring in their private wildness. Mason stood for several long moments, processing what had just occurred. The rational, scientific part of his mind, the part shaped by decades of wildlife management training and professional observation, struggled to categorize the experience within familiar frameworks. Wild predators did not behave this way. They did not lead humans to their dens, did not deliberately reveal vulnerable offspring, did not initiate physical contact without provocation or threat. There was no precedent for such behavior in any wildlife manual he had ever studied. No protocol for how to respond to such extraordinary departure from expected patterns. Yet the emotional truth of the encounter was undeniable, a reality that transcended the limitations of scientific categorization. Something profound had passed between himself and these wild creatures, something that spoke to connections deeper than the conventional boundaries between human and animal, domesticated and wild. He had been granted access to a moment of recognition. Across species lines, a brief bridge across what had always seemed an unbridgeable divide. As he finally turned to begin his journey back through the forest, Mason felt a subtle but significant shift in his perception of the wilderness around him. The trees, the river, the unseen presence of countless creatures going about their lives in the complex ecosystem, all remained physically unchanged, yet his relationship to them seemed altered in some fundamental way. He was still human, still separate in the many ways that humans had always been separate from the wild world. Yet that separation now felt less absolute, more permeable than he had previously understood. The hike back to the trailhead passed in a kind of meditative trance, his body moving automatically along the familiar path, while his mind processed the extraordinary encounter. By the time he reached his truck, the sun had passed its zenith and begun its westward descent, casting the forest in the golden light of late afternoon. Mason placed his backpack on the passenger seat and paused, looking back at the tree line, as if half expecting to glimpse a tawny form watching from the shadows. There was nothing visible, of course. The bobcats were creatures of secrecy and stealth, visible only when they chose to be seen. Yet the absence of physical presence did nothing to diminish the reality of the connection that had been established. Something had changed in the fabric of his understanding, a shift that would accompany him back to his human dwelling and into whatever future still awaited him. The drive home was a transition between worlds, from the primal rhythms of the forest to the more ordered patterns of human habitation. As Pinecrest came into view, its scattered buildings nestled against the mountainside, Mason felt the familiar sense of return, but with a new undertone, as if he were bringing something back with him from the wilderness, something precious and previously undiscovered. His small house welcomed him with the comforting familiarity of a space shaped to his particular needs and habits. Yet as he moved through the evening routine, storing gear, showering away the day's exertions, preparing a simple meal, Mason was aware of carrying the forest encounter within him, an experience too significant to be neatly filed away with other memories of wilderness observation. After dinner, drawn by an impulse he didn't attempt to analyze, he settled once more at Sarah's writing desk and opened the leather-bound journal that now contained his account of the original Bobcat rescue. The blank pages following that narrative seemed to invite continuation, an acknowledgement that the story had not ended with his return to civilization, but had instead taken an unexpected new turn with today's extraordinary encounter. For the second time, Mason found himself writing not with the detached precision of a field biologist, but with the engaged immediacy of someone attempting to capture an experience that transcended professional categories. The words flowed easily, recreating the sequence of events from his arrival at the river to that final, astonishing moment when the rescued cub had briefly pressed against his hand in what could only be described as recognition. As he wrote, Mason became aware that he was documenting something beyond a simple wildlife encounter, remarkable though it was. He was tracking his own transformation, the subtle but profound shift in perspective that had begun with the impulsive decision to risk himself for a drowning wild creature and continued through each subsequent interaction with the Bobcat family. The story was as much about his changing relationship with the wilderness and perhaps with himself as it was about the extraordinary behavior of the wild animals who had entered his life in such unexpected fashion. He finished writing well. After midnight, the completed account filling several pages with handwriting that had grown progressively more fluid as the narrative unfolded. Reading over what he had written, Mason was struck by how inadequate words seemed to capture the full dimensions of what had transpired, the nuances of the Bobcat's behavior, the complexity of emotions the encounter had evoked in him, the sense of having briefly accessed some deeper current of connection that usually remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience. Yet inadequate or not, the written record felt important, a way of honoring what had occurred and preserving it against the inevitable erosion of memory. Whatever meaning the experience might ultimately hold, whatever understanding might eventually emerge from this unlikely intersection of human and wild lives, the first step was simply to acknowledge what had happened, to bear witness to a moment when the usual boundaries between species had briefly, mysteriously dissolved. Sleep came easily that night, deep and dreamless, as if the day's events had satisfied some hunger Mason hadn't fully recognized until it was appeased. He woke the following morning with an unusual sense of clarity, the typical haziness of transition from sleep to wakefulness replaced by immediate, focused awareness. As he moved through his morning routine, he found himself contemplating what came next, not just in the pragmatic sense of daily activities, but in the larger context of how to integrate his extraordinary experiences into the continuing narrative of his life. The answer came to him while preparing his first cup of coffee, an idea so obvious in retrospect that he wondered why it hadn't occurred to him immediately. Emma had suggested writing down his experiences, and he had done so, creating a private record in Sarah's journal. But there was another step possible, one that aligned with his lifelong commitment to conservation and education, sharing the story. More broadly, allowing others to glimpse the extraordinary connection he had been privileged to experience. Not as scientific observation, though it certainly held implications for understanding animal cognition and behavior, but as a narrative that might open others to a deeper appreciation of the complex inner lives of the creatures with whom humans shared the planet. Sarah had often gently chided him for his reluctance to speak in more personal terms about his wilderness experiences, suggesting that factual accuracy and emotional truth were not mutually exclusive, but complementary aspects of genuine understanding. People protect what they care about, she had told him once, and they care about what they connect with. Sometimes a story does more for conservation than a dozen scientific papers. Mason had acknowledged her point intellectually without fully embracing its implications for his own approach to wildlife education. Now, with the Bobcat encounter still vivid in his memory, her wisdom resonated in a new way. Perhaps this story, his story, their story, could serve as a bridge for others as it had for him, an invitation to recognize the possibility of genuine connection across the boundaries that separated human from wild. The local nature center where Mason volunteered regularly hosted evening presentations on wildlife and conservation topics. Most speakers were visiting researchers or regional experts, but occasionally local naturalists shared their knowledge of the area's flora and fauna. The center's director, Karen Michaels, had been trying for months to persuade Mason to give a talk drawing on his decades of ranger experience. But he had always deflected the invitation, uncomfortable with the public speaking role that had never been his favorite aspect of ranger duties. Now, however, the idea held a different appeal. This wasn't about positioning himself as an expert or authority, but about sharing an experience that had challenged his own understanding and opened him to new possibilities of connection with the natural world. If approached with the proper humility as a personal narrative rather than a scientific claim, perhaps the story could serve the educational mission he had dedicated his professional life to without compromising the integrity of his training or the dignity of the wild creatures who had granted him such unprecedented access to their lives. Decision made, Mason reached for his phone and dialed the nature center's number. Karen answered on the third ring, her voice bright with the enthusiasm that had made her such an effective advocate for local conservation efforts. "Mason, good to hear from you. Please tell me you're calling about those bird surveys we discussed." "For the spring migration, actually," he replied, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "I'm calling about that presentation you've been after me to do. I think I'm ready now, but it might not be quite what you were expecting." There was a momentary pause before Karen responded, her tone shifting from surprise to cautious interest. "I'm intrigued. What did you have in mind?" "A story," Mason said simply, "about an encounter that's changed how I see the relationship between humans and wild animals. It's not conventional science, Karen. It's more experiential. But I think it might be valuable if presented in the right context. The best presentations always combine solid information with personal connection," Karen replied, her interest clearly piqued. "And coming from someone with your background and credibility, even an unconventional approach would carry weight. Can you give me a hint about this encounter?" Mason hesitated, aware of how fantastical the bare outlines of the story might sound, without the full context. "It involves bobcats," he said finally, "a mother and cubs, one of which I rescued from drowning during last week's storm. But what happened afterward? Well, that's the heart of the story, and it doesn't fit neatly into our usual understanding of wild animal behavior." "Now I'm really curious," Karen said, and Mason could hear the smile in her voice. "We have an opening in the evening lecture series 3 weeks from now, A researcher from CSU had to reschedule. Would that work for you? 3 weeks. The time frame felt both too immediate and exactly right, soon enough that the experiences would still be fresh in his memory, yet allowing sufficient time to organize his thoughts and prepare a presentation that would do justice to the complexity of what had occurred. I think that would work, he agreed, though I'd appreciate your input on how to frame this. It's not the kind of presentation I've given before. Why don't you come by tomorrow afternoon? Karen suggested. We can discuss format and approach, maybe brainstorm some ways to present the material effectively without sensationalizing it. I know how important accuracy and responsible messaging are to you. I'd appreciate that, Mason replied, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation at the prospect of transforming his private experience into a public narrative. I'll see you tomorrow then. After ending the call, Mason sat for several moments with his coffee, contemplating the commitment he had just made. There was risk in sharing such an unconventional experience, particularly given his professional background and the skepticism with which many in the scientific community viewed anecdotal accounts of seemingly extraordinary animal behavior. Yet, there was also potential for meaningful impact, a chance to invite others into a recognition of the complex inner lives of wild creatures and the possibilities for connection that might exist beyond conventional understanding. Sarah would have approved, he thought with a small smile. She had always believed in the power of personal narrative to bridge gaps in understanding, to open hearts to conservation messages that might otherwise remain abstract or distant. In sharing this story, perhaps he was honoring not just the remarkable creatures who had granted him such unprecedented access to their wild lives, but also the woman who had spent decades gently encouraging him to recognize the value of his own experiences beyond their scientific categorization. The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparation, unlike anything Mason had undertaken since retirement. With Karen's guidance, he structured his presentation to balance personal narrative with relevant scientific context, information about bobcat behavior and ecology, insights into animal cognition research that might help frame the extraordinary aspects of his experience without overreaching into anthropomorphism or unsupported claims. He selected photographs from his years as a ranger to illustrate the typical behaviors and habitats of bobcats in the region, creating visual context for his verbal account. For the specific encounters with the mother and cubs, where no photographs existed, he worked with a local wildlife artist to create simple sketches based on his detailed descriptions, images that would convey the essence of what had occurred, without the sensationalism that might accompany more dramatic artistic interpretations. The evening of Mason's presentation arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting for the occasion. The late September sky deepened to indigo as he parked outside the Pinecrest Nature Center, a modest building constructed of local stone and timber that served as the hub for environmental education in the region. Through the windows, he could see that the small auditorium was already filling with people, a turnout that both gratified and slightly unnerved him, driving home the public nature of the commitment he had made. Karen met him at the staff entrance, her practical enthusiasm providing a welcome counterpoint to his growing nervousness. "We've got a full house," she informed him with evident satisfaction. Word got around that the reclusive former ranger Mason Thorne was finally going to speak about his wildlife experiences. "I think half the town showed up out of sheer curiosity." "Great," Mason replied with a wry smile. "No pressure there. You'll be fine," Karen assured him, leading the way to the small room behind the auditorium that served as a preparation space for speakers. "Just tell your story the way you told it to me. The authenticity is what makes it powerful. Don't overthink it." Mason nodded, grateful for her confidence, even as he wondered if he had made a grave error in judgment. The story he was about to share pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional wildlife biology, venturing into territory that some might dismiss as sentimental anthropomorphism or worse, deliberate fabrication for dramatic effect. Yet every detail was true, rendered as accurately as human perception and memory allowed, regardless of how extraordinary some elements might appear to those who hadn't been present to witness them. As the final minutes before his presentation ticked away, Mason reviewed his notes one last time, though he knew the sequence of events by heart. The story had lived with him constantly these past weeks, weaving itself into his dreams, coloring his daily activities with its lingering presence. The Bobcats themselves had not reappeared since that last remarkable encounter at their den, but he had sensed their unseen presence during his forest walks, an awareness that transcended physical sighting to become a kind of intuitive recognition of shared territory. Karen reappeared at the doorway. "We're ready for you," she said simply, offering an encouraging smile. "Remember, just tell your truth. That's all anyone can ask." Mason followed her to the side of the small stage where a podium awaited, equipped with a microphone and a computer for the slideshow he had prepared. The audience quieted as Karen stepped to the center to make introductions, her clear voice carrying easily through the well-designed acoustics of the room. "Many of you know Mason Thorne from his 30 years of service as a ranger in our national forest," she began. "Some of you may have participated in his educational programs or benefited from his knowledge during wilderness emergencies. What you may not know is that Mason has been reluctant to share his more personal wildlife encounters, believing that scientific objectivity should take precedence over individual experience." She paused, smiling at Mason before continuing. "Recently, however, something happened that challenged that perspective, an encounter so extraordinary that it deserved to be shared beyond the confines of field notes or research papers. Tonight, Mason will tell that story, not as an expert making scientific claims, but as a witness to something remarkable that occurred in our shared wilderness. Please join me in welcoming Mason Thorne." The applause that followed was warm and enthusiastic. Faces turned expectantly toward the podium as Mason stepped into place. He surveyed the audience briefly, recognizing many familiar faces. Fellow volunteers from the Nature Center, neighbors from Pinecrest, several former colleagues from his ranger days. In the second row, Emma sat with an encouraging smile, her presence a silent affirmation of the decision to share this deeply personal experience. "Thank you for coming," Mason began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "As Karen mentioned, I've generally preferred to keep my personal experiences separate from my professional observations of wildlife. That separation seemed important, a way to maintain the objectivity necessary for sound conservation decisions and accurate public education." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But sometimes an experience comes along that challenges our neat categories, that refuses to be contained within conventional frameworks of understanding. What I'm going to share with you tonight is such an experience, a series of encounters with a mother bobcat and her cubs that defied everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between human and wild awareness." With that introduction, Mason launched into his narrative, starting with the fateful decision to hike despite threatening weather and the desperate cries that had first drawn his attention to the mother bobcat on the river's edge. As he spoke, images appeared on the screen behind him, photographs of the Silverstone River in various conditions, maps of the watershed, a striking image of an adult female bobcat captured during a wildlife survey years earlier. The visuals provided context, while allowing his words to carry the emotional weight of the story. He described the river rescue in careful detail, neither dramatizing the danger nor minimizing the extraordinary nature of his decision to intervene in what most would consider a purely natural tragedy. The audience listened with rapt attention, the room so quiet that the soft hum of the heating system became noticeable in the pauses between his sentences. "I expected the mother to flee when I emerged from the water with her cub," Mason continued, advancing to a slide showing a simple sketch of the riverbank scene. That would have been the normal response, the instinct for self-preservation overriding even maternal concern when a large predator like a human approaches. Instead, she remained, watching as I placed her cub on the ground, displaying none of the aggression or fear that characterizes typical bobcat encounters with humans. From there, the story grew increasingly extraordinary, the mother following him to his cabin, voluntarily entering the human dwelling, allowing him to care for her cub through the night. With each development, Mason was careful to acknowledge the departure from expected behavior, offering possible explanations grounded in animal cognition research, while not oversimplifying the profound mystery at the heart of the encounters. "I can't tell you what was happening in that mother bobcat's mind," he admitted, as he described the moment when she had briefly pressed her head against his knee in that gesture of acceptance or acknowledgement. "I don't have access to her thought processes or decision-making in any scientific sense. What I can tell you is what I observed, a series of behaviors that suggested a level of trust and intentionality I had never witnessed in 3 decades of wildlife work." The room remained silent, faces attentive as the narrative continued through the return to the forest, the discovery of the relocated den, and finally, most extraordinarily, the rescued cub's brief touch against his hand. That moment of connection, across species boundaries that had affected Mason so deeply. As he described this culminating interaction, he was surprised to feel emotion tightening his throat, the memory still powerful enough to break through his habitual reserve. "I've asked myself many times what this experience means," Mason said as he approached the conclusion of his presentation. "Does it represent a level of cognitive sophistication in bobcats that we haven't previously documented? Was it an extraordinarily rare individual whose behavior shouldn't be generalized to the species as a whole? Or was it simply a series of coincidences that my human brain has assembled into a pattern of apparent meaning and connection?" He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. The scientist in me is cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from a single anecdotal experience, however carefully observed. But the human being who lived through these encounters cannot dismiss the profound sense of recognition, of genuine connection that occurred between myself and these wild creatures. Something happened out there that transcended our usual categories of understanding, and I believe it's worth acknowledging, even if we can't fully explain it within our current frameworks. Mason advanced to his final slide, a stunning photograph of the Silverstone Valley at sunset, the river a ribbon of gold, winding through forested slopes toward distant mountains. What I take from this experience, beyond the extraordinary privilege of such intimate interaction with creatures normally so elusive, is a reminder of how much remains unknown about the inner lives of the species with whom we share this planet. If a supposedly simple predator like a bobcat is capable of the complex decision-making and apparent recognition I witnessed, what other capacities might exist in the creatures around us that we have yet to recognize or understand? He smiled slightly, aware of how far he had traveled from the strictly empirical approach that had characterized his professional life. Sarah, my late wife, used to tell me that wonder and scientific rigor weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a full engagement with the natural world. I think she was right. My experience with the bobcats has deepened rather than diminished my appreciation for the complexity of wild lives and the ecosystems that sustain them. It has reminded me that even after decades of study and observation, the wilderness still holds mysteries worthy of our humility and attention. Mason looked out over the audience one final time. "Thank you for allowing me to share this story. I offer it not as a scientific claim requiring your belief or acceptance, but as a personal testimony to the extraordinary possibilities that exist in our relationship with the wild world. Possibilities that might become more accessible if we approach that world with openness, as well as rigor, with heart as well as mind." The silence that followed his conclusion lasted several heartbeats, a collective processing of the remarkable narrative they had just heard. Then applause erupted, spontaneous and enthusiastic, filling the small auditorium with affirmation. Mason stepped back from the podium, unexpectedly moved by the response. He had entered the evening uncertain about the reception his unconventional story might receive. Now, looking at the engaged expressions before him, he felt a weight lifting, the burden of keeping extraordinary experience private, contained within boundaries too narrow to hold its full significance. Karen approached the podium as the applause began to subside. "Thank you, Mason, for sharing that remarkable story. We'll now take questions from the audience, keeping in mind that Mason has been clear about the personal nature of his account and the limitations of drawing broader scientific conclusions from individual experience." Hands rose immediately throughout the room. Karen pointed to a silver-haired woman in the front row whom Mason recognized as the retired biology teacher from the local high school. "In all my years studying wildlife behavior, I've never heard anything quite like this," the woman began. "Have you considered reaching out to researchers who study animal cognition to see if there are frameworks that might help explain what you experienced?" Mason nodded, appreciating the thoughtful nature of the question. "I have, actually. There's fascinating work being done on recognition, memory, and social intelligence in species we previously considered primarily instinct-driven. Some researchers at the University of Colorado have expressed interest in hearing more about these encounters, though they're appropriately cautious about drawing conclusions from anecdotal evidence, however carefully documented." The next question came from a young man Mason didn't recognize. "Do you think your experience with the bobcats was completely unique, or might similar connections be possible for others who approach wildlife with the right attitude?" "That's an excellent question," Mason replied, considering his response carefully. "I wouldn't want to suggest that anyone should attempt to interact with wild predators. That would be dangerous for both humans and animals in most circumstances. But I do think there's something to be said for approaching wildlife observation with a quality of attention that goes beyond data collection. A willingness to recognize the individual nature of the creatures we encounter rather than seeing them merely as representatives of their species." He paused, then continued. "Many indigenous cultures describe relationships with wild animals that Western science has traditionally dismissed as myth or metaphor. My experience has made me wonder if perhaps those traditional knowledge systems contain insights about animal awareness and interspecies communication that our scientific frameworks are only beginning to recognize or accommodate." Questions continued for nearly half an hour, ranging from specific details about bobcat behavior to broader philosophical inquiries about the nature of consciousness across species lines. Mason answered each with the same careful balance of factual precision and openness to mystery that had characterized his main presentation, neither retreating into rigid empiricism nor abandoning the critical thinking that had shaped his professional life. Finally, Karen indicated that time had run out for the formal session. "Mason has kindly agreed to remain for a while if people would like to speak with him individually," she announced. "We also have refreshments in the lobby. Please join me in thanking him once more for sharing this extraordinary story." The applause that followed was even more enthusiastic than before, several people rising to their feet in appreciation. As the formal session concluded and the audience began moving toward the lobby, Emma approached the podium, her eyes bright with emotion. "Mom would have loved every minute of that," she said, embracing Mason briefly. You found the perfect balance, honoring the science while acknowledging the mystery. I'm so proud of you for sharing this. It felt right, Mason admitted. Scary, but right. Like I was honoring not just my experience, but those bobcats too, recognizing the significance of what happened between us. Exactly, Emma agreed. And judging by the response, it resonated with a lot of people here. You've given them something to think about beyond the usual categories of wildlife appreciation or conservation appeals. Before Mason could respond, a small crowd had gathered around them, people eager to share their own wildlife encounters or express appreciation for his willingness to step beyond conventional presentations. For the next hour, he found himself engaged in conversations that ranged from practical questions about bobcat conservation to philosophical explorations of interspecies communication and the nature of consciousness. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the last visitors departed and Mason began helping Karen and the other volunteers clean up the auditorium. The evening had been more successful than he could have imagined, the story finding receptive hearts and minds despite, or perhaps because of, its extraordinary nature. Something had shifted not just in his own relationship with that experience, but in his understanding of how such experiences might be shared, how personal truth and scientific rigor might coexist without diminishing either. You've started something here, Karen remarked as they finished putting away the chairs. People are already asking when you might speak again, whether you'd be willing to lead specialized wildlife observation walks focusing on the aspect of connection you described. Mason raised his eyebrows, surprised by the suggestion. That wasn't my intention in sharing the story. The best ripple effects rarely are intentional, Karen replied with a smile. But think about it. There's clearly an appetite for the kind of bridge you're creating between scientific understanding and personal connection with the natural world. You have a unique perspective to offer. The idea was both daunting and unexpectedly appealing. Throughout his ranger career, Mason had focused primarily on the management and educational aspects of conservation. Practical work grounded in ecological science and administrative policy. The more subjective dimensions of human-nature relationship had remained largely private, shared perhaps with Sarah but rarely incorporated into his professional identity or public role. Yet his experience with the bobcats had revealed limitations in that approach, suggesting possibilities for connection and understanding that transcended conventional categories without abandoning their valuable insights. Perhaps there was a contribution he could make in this previously unexplored territory, not as an expert claiming authoritative knowledge, but as an experienced observer, willing to acknowledge both the empirical and the mysterious aspects of our relationship with the wild world. I'll think about it, he promised Karen, meaning it. It's not a direction I ever expected to take, but then again, neither was diving into a flood-swollen river to save a bobcat cub. Sometimes the most meaningful paths are the ones we never planned to walk. Later that night, as Mason stood on his back porch gazing at the star-filled sky above the dark silhouettes of pine trees, he felt a sense of completion that had been missing since Sarah's death. Not an end to grief or longing for her presence, but a reconnection to purpose and meaning that extended beyond personal loss. The bobcat encounters had awakened something that had been dormant too long, a capacity for wonder, for genuine engagement with the world beyond the boundaries of his solitary routine. A soft sound from the forest edge caught his attention. Not the distinctive call of a bobcat, but perhaps an owl passing silently between hunting grounds or a deer moving cautiously through undergrowth. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was his renewed awareness of the countless lives unfolding in the darkness around his human dwelling, each with its own trajectory and significance. its own form of awareness, however different from human consciousness. Mason returned to the river many times in the months that followed, each visit a quiet pilgrimage to the place where something extraordinary had transformed his understanding of the relationship between humans and wild creatures. Sometimes he sat for hours on the fallen log near the bobcat's den, patient and observant as he had been throughout his ranger career, receptive to whatever the forest might reveal without demanding or expecting specific encounters. Occasionally, he glimpsed the mother bobcat in the distance, a tawny shape moving with fluid grace along the riverbank or disappearing into thickets rich with potential prey. Once he spotted both cubs, noticeably larger and more coordinated, practicing hunting pounces on fallen leaves while their mother watched from a nearby boulder. He made no attempt to approach or interact, content with these brief, precious glimpses into lives that continued along their wild trajectory, intersecting with his own in increasingly rare but meaningful moments. Winter arrived, transforming the forest with snow and ice, the Silverstone partially freezing along its edges while maintaining a dark, swift current at its center. Mason's visits became less frequent, limited by weather and trail conditions, though he still made the journey when conditions allowed, drawn by a connection that remained powerful despite the increasing rarity of actual sightings. His presentation at the Nature Center had unexpected consequences beyond the evening itself. Word spread through the regional conservation community, and soon Mason found himself invited to speak at other venues, small environmental organizations, university, seminars, even a regional TEDx event focused on human-nature relationships. He accepted selectively, maintaining the careful balance between sharing his extraordinary experience and protecting it from sensationalism or misinterpretation. Emma helped him refine his approach for these presentations, her legal training proving valuable in framing the narrative in ways that acknowledged its extraordinary nature, while emphasizing the factual foundation beneath the more inexplicable elements. Together, they developed an educational program that used the Bobcat story as an entry point to explore broader questions about animal cognition, interspecies relationships, and the limitations of conventional frameworks for understanding wild awareness. By spring, these programs had evolved into occasional guided experiences in the forest, not wildlife viewing in the traditional sense, but what Mason came to call attentive presence walks, teaching participants a quality of awareness that went beyond data collection or checklist species identification to a more nuanced engagement with the living landscape. He limited these groups to no more than 6 people at a time, carefully screening participants to ensure they understood the focus on quiet observation rather than guaranteed sightings or interactions. Wild creatures aren't exhibits or entertainment, he explained to each group before they entered the forest. We're guests in their home, with no right to demand their appearance or attention. What we're practicing is a way of being present that might create opportunities for genuine encounter, but always on their terms, never ours. On one such walk in early May, with wildflowers blooming in forest clearings and the scent of new growth permeating the warming air, Mason led a small group to a meadow near the river, a spot he had come to favor for its combination of open space and proximity to diverse habitats where wildlife might be observed without disturbance. The participants settled quietly at the meadow's edge, practicing the patient awareness Mason had been teaching throughout the morning. After nearly an hour of stillness, during which they had observed chickadees, a red squirrel, and a group of mule deer at the far edge of the clearing, a movement at the forest margin caught Mason's attention. His breath caught as he recognized the distinctive silhouette emerging cautiously from the shadows. The mother bobcat, now visibly leaner after the challenges of winter, but moving with the same confident grace he remembered. She paused at the edge of the clearing, amber eyes scanning the opposite side where Mason and his small group sat motionless. There was no possible way she could have failed to detect their presence. Bobcat's acute senses would have registered the human scent long before visual confirmation. Yet instead of retreating immediately into the forest, as wild bobcats typically would, she remained at the meadow's edge, her attention seeming to fix on Mason's position with particular intensity. For several heartbeats, time seemed suspended as human and wild creature regarded each other across the open space. Mason made no movement, expressed no expectation, even as his heart raced with the significance of this moment. The mother bobcat voluntarily making herself visible despite the presence of multiple humans, acknowledging the connection that had been forged in those extraordinary encounters months earlier. Then, with the same deliberate quality that had characterized all her interactions with him, the mother bobcat lowered her head slightly before turning and disappearing back into the forest with silent efficiency. The gesture was brief, subtle enough that someone unfamiliar with their history might have dismissed it as coincidence or imagination. But Mason knew with unshakable certainty what he had witnessed. A final acknowledgement across the species barrier, a deliberate connection made visible. When the group had departed later that afternoon, full of excitement about their rare bobcat sighting but unaware of its deeper significance, Mason returned alone to the meadow. The forest had quieted in the late afternoon light, the frenetic activity of morning giving way to the more measured rhythms of approaching evening. He stood at the spot where the mother bobcat had appeared, feeling not the sharp pang of goodbye, but the gentler acceptance of a circle completing itself naturally, in its own time and manner. The extraordinary chapter that had begun with a desperate rescue in a storm-swollen river had reached its conclusion, not with dramatic finality, but with the quiet acknowledgement that all relationships, even the most unusual and profound, exist within the larger patterns of life and death, connection and separation. The mother bobcat and her cubs would continue their wild existence, perhaps never again intersecting directly with human experience in the way they had with Mason. But the bridge that had been briefly, miraculously established between their worlds remained real, a testament to possibilities that transcended conventional understanding of the boundaries between human and wild awareness. As Mason turned to begin his journey home through the darkening forest, he carried that knowledge not as a burden of exceptional experience, but as a gift, one that had transformed his retirement from an ending into a beginning, opening doors to new forms of connection and purpose he could never have anticipated on that storm-threatened afternoon when he had first heard a mother's desperate cries for her drowning cub. Some bonds, formed in the most unexpected circumstances, leave their mark forever, subtle but indelible, a reminder of the infinite possibilities that exist within and beyond our familiar ways of seeing the world. 2 years after Mason's extraordinary encounter with the Bobcat family, the Whispering Pines region faced an unprecedented crisis. A devastating wildfire, sparked by lightning and fueled by drought conditions, tore through the western slopes of the valley, threatening both wildlife habitat and the human communities nestled along the forest edge. Emergency evacuations were ordered for Pinecrest and surrounding settlements as the fire line advanced relentlessly through tinder-dry forests. Mason had been assisting with wildlife assessments when the evacuation order came through. Rather than heading directly to the designated shelter, he made a detour to his home, determined to retrieve Sarah's journal containing his detailed account of the Bobcat encounters, a possession too personally valuable to abandon to the flames. The sky had turned an apocalyptic orange, ash falling like grey snow as he hastily packed the journal along with a few irreplaceable photos into his truck. He was about to leave when movement on his porch caught his eye. Through the smoky haze, a tawny shape materialized, unmistakably a bobcat, but not the mother he had known. This was a younger animal, nearly full-grown, but still showing traces of the proportions that marked adolescence rather than full maturity. It stood motionless, amber eyes fixed on Mason through the glass door with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. Recognition dawned with stunning clarity. This was one of the cubs, the very one he had pulled from the river, now grown into early adulthood. The distinctive gait as it moved closer to the door confirmed it, a barely perceptible unevenness in its stride. Legacy of the trauma its small body had endured in the raging current 2 years earlier. For several heartbeats, Mason remained frozen, overwhelmed by the bobcat's presence at this critical moment. Then, a distant explosion, perhaps a propane. A tank caught in the advancing fire, broke the spell. The evacuation order couldn't be ignored any longer. The fire was approaching too rapidly for delay. Yet the bobcat remained on his porch, showing no sign of retreating despite the increasing danger. Wild animals typically fled well ahead of fire fronts, their acute senses warning them long before humans received official alerts. This bobcat's behavior defied natural instinct. It should have been miles away, seeking safety in areas unthreatened by the advancing flames. Mason opened his door cautiously, expecting the bobcat to bolt at this direct confrontation. Instead, it backed up only a few paces, maintaining eye contact with a focus that seemed deliberately communicative. When Mason stepped fully onto the porch, the bobcat moved to the steps, looked back at him, then took a few more steps down the path that led toward the eastern ridge, away from the fire's approach and toward the evacuation route. The implication was so fantastical that Mason's rational mind initially rejected it. Yet as the bobcat paused again, looking back with that same intent focus, alternative explanations seemed increasingly inadequate. Somehow, impossibly, the grown cub appeared to be urging him to follow, to move away from the danger advancing. "Oh, from the west. Are you returning the favor?" Mason whispered, the question emerging from someplace deeper than conscious thought. The bobcat made a soft chirping sound, not unlike the vocalizations he had heard from the mother years earlier. Then continued down the path, pausing every few yards to ensure Mason followed. Led by this most unlikely guide, he reached his truck and placed his precious cargo inside. When he turned back, the bobcat had disappeared, vanishing into the smoky underbrush as silently as it had appeared. Days later, when the fire was finally contained and residents were permitted to return to assess damage, Mason found his home miraculously spared. The fire line had stopped less than 50 yards from his property, diverted by a last-minute wind shift that firefighters described as unprecedented and unexplainable. In the clearing behind his house, clearly visible in the ash-covered ground, were bobcat tracks, a deliberate trail that circled his entire property before heading east into the unburned forest beyond.